Tonight, I want to walk with you toward the strangest machine our species has ever seriously proposed building. We call it a generation ship, a vessel so large it works as a small world, and so slow that crossing to the nearest star would take centuries. In the films, it is the great adventure of our future. The people who switch it on at launch will be long gone before it arrives. The ones who step off at the far end have not been born yet, and may not be for 1,000 years. And the people in between would not simply wait out the dark, they would change. Evolution does not pause for the journey. It drifts, generation after generation, into shapes no one chose, until you might not recognize your own descendants as human. Why, the reality of a generation ship is far more terrifying than you think. Right now, almost 50 years after it left, a small spacecraft called Voyager 1 is still flying away from the Sun at about 38,000 miles an hour. It is the fastest object our species has ever thrown clear of the solar system, and it has held that speed without rest for half a century. It has already pushed past the edge of the Sun's reach, out beyond the bubble of solar wind that wraps the planets, into true interstellar space. A radio whisper from it now takes around 22 hours to reach us, running at the speed of light the entire way. And for all of that, if the nearest star were its finish line, Voyager has covered less than 1,000th of the distance. The fastest machine we have ever built, given a whole human lifetime of flight, has not yet crossed the first 1/10 of 1% of the way to the closest star to our own. The star Voyager would be aiming at is Proxima Centauri, a faint red ember a little over 4 light-years off. Light itself, the fastest thing the universe permits, needs 4 years and 3 months to make the trip. Voyager, at the best speed we can currently manage, would need more than 70,000 years. 70,000 years is not a figure to nod at and walk past. Reach that far back through our own history, and you land around the time our species was first leaving Africa, before farming, before any city, before a single word that still survives was ever spoken aloud. Every empire, every book, the whole written record of humankind, fits inside that span about 15 times over. A ship that left tonight at Voyager's pace would not arrive late. Its passengers would belong to a different chapter of the human story than the one that waved them off. Voyager, of course, was never built to sprint, and better engines live on the drawing board. Designs that ride the shock of nuclear detonations, rockets that burn the fusion reaction lighting the stars, sails shoved along by lasers fired from home. Each could, in principle, reach real speed. The hopeful ceiling for any of them is a few % of the speed of light. Take 1%. Already far past anything we know how to build. At 1% of light speed, a ship crosses nearly 3,000 kilometers every second, and the trip to Proxima still runs beyond 400 years. 4 centuries is longer than the time since the first lens was turned toward the night sky. Hand the journey to the most powerful engine anyone has seriously drawn, and the number barely flinches. No one who boards will be alive to watch it end. Move fast enough, and time slows for the traveler. The crew's clocks fall behind the rest of the universe, and the trip feels shorter from inside the ship than from outside it. The slowing only grows large as you crowd up against the speed of light itself. At 1% of that speed, it is almost nothing. Trim the felt length of a 400-year crossing, and you save about a week. The crew ages at very near the ordinary rate, and the long chain of lives still has to form. And Proxima is the gentle case. The stars most likely to hold a world a person could actually stand on are not the nearest ones, a calmer star, close kin to our Sun, sits nearer to 12 light-years out. Others worth the crossing lie 20, 50, 100. Pick a destination for how livable it might be, rather than how close it sits, and the centuries swell into thousands of years. Count it in human terms. A 400-year crossing runs to something like 16 generations, parent to child to grandchild, the whole stretch of time from Shakespeare's century to ours, spent inside one hull. Aim for that kinder star 12 light-years out, and the chain runs closer to 50 generations deep. Distance divided by any speed a living body can survive still lands on a number larger than a human life. You do not get under it with a better rocket. You get under it only by changing what the traveler is. And that single change quietly destroys something we never knew we leaned on. Every journey any human has ever made carried one feature so constant that no one bothered to name it. The person who set out was the person who arrived. The feet that started the walk out of the valley finished it. The eyes that watched the home shore sink were the eyes that saw the new coast rise. The astronaut who rode the rocket up came back down in the same body, a few days older. Start and finish always lived in the same skull, because they had never once had a reason not to. A generation ship is the first machine ever proposed that pulls them apart on purpose. The one who decides to go is not the one who goes. The one who goes is not the one who lands. The traveler stops being a person and turns into a relay, a line of hands passing one intention forward through the dark, each letting go before the finish, trusting the next to keep its grip. The first hand in that line is the one that stops me. The founders are the only people in the whole undertaking who choose it with a living memory of Earth behind their eyes, and what they are choosing, fully awake to it, is to be the part of the journey that never arrives. Every explorer before them bet their own life against a place they might still reach. The founders bet their lives against a place they know for certain they will never see. The engines lock that choice in place with a force that has nothing to do with how long anyone lives. A ship that spends centuries gathering speed has to spend centuries bleeding it off again. Past a certain mark in that long push, turning around stops being possible. The fuel to reverse is already burned getting up to speed, and the time to drift home would outlast everyone aboard. Go fast enough that one life can hold the whole crossing after all, finish in decades instead of centuries, and let the traveler stay a single person from the first step to the last. The trouble waiting there is that the empty space between the stars is not as empty as it looks, and speed is the exact thing that turns it against you. What does a single grain of dust become when you meet it at 1/100th of the speed of light? A single milligram of rock, the kind of grain you could lose in the creases of your palm, does almost nothing at the speeds we live at. Throw it across a room and it taps the far wall. Meet that same grain head-on at 1% of the speed of light, and it arrives carrying the energy of about a kilogram of high explosive. Nothing about the grain has changed, only the closing speed. All that energy was always waiting in the gap between your velocity and its stillness, ready the instant the two of you touched. Push the ship to 1/10th of light speed, and the same speck hits 100 times harder, with the force of 100 kilograms of explosive folded into something you can barely see. That is the first surprise about going fast. Speed does not carry you past the dangers of space. It builds them out of things that were never dangerous. Grains that size are rare between the stars. The hazard that never lets up is smaller and far more constant. The space between stars carries a thin haze of gas, mostly single hydrogen atoms, at a density of roughly 1 atom in every cubic centimeter. A cubic centimeter is about the size of a sugar cube. 1 atom inside a sugar cube of vacuum is as near to nothing as matter ever gets. At walking pace, it is nothing. At 1% of light speed, your ship sweeps through trillions of those atoms every second, across every square meter of the face it points forward. Each one lands with the sting of a small particle of radiation. Together they become a steady wind of it, blowing back into the hull, hour after hour, century after century. Lean on the speed harder, and the wind sharpens. At 1/10 of light speed, those same hydrogen atoms carry enough energy to lodge themselves in metal and tear through living tissue. By moving, the ship has turned the calm interstellar haze into a beam of penetrating radiation aimed at its own crew. A particle accelerator takes ordinary matter and whips it to enormous speed so it can strike a target with violence. A fast starship is that machine read backwards. The target hangs still in space. The accelerator is the ship, and the crew lives inside the spot where the beam comes down. The first defense anyone reaches for is armor. Put something thick across the front and let it absorb the hits. Armor works. It also fights the whole reason for going fast. Every kilogram of shielding is a kilogram. The engines must haul up to speed beside the people. The faster you want to travel, the fiercer the bombardment, the thicker the shield, and the more mass you have to accelerate to outrun a danger your own speed created. Protection and propulsion pull in opposite directions, and the rope between them shortens the harder you push. Somewhere along it lies a speed where the shield you need to live weighs more than any engine can move. That speed is the real ceiling, and it sits far below the speed of light. Cleverer shields exist than a slab of metal. Spacecraft already use a trick called a bumper, a thin outer sheet held a little ahead of the real hull. A particle that strikes the bumper does not punch straight through. It shatters and vaporizes on contact, and the spray spreads across the gap, so what reaches the hull behind is a diffuse puff instead of a single needle. Stacked thin layers can stop impacts that no solid wall could, at a fraction of the weight. It is real engineering, and it buys a great deal. It does not buy enough. At interstellar speed, the bumpers themselves erode, the layers wear out and need replacing, and the whole stack is still mass the engines are obliged to carry. The trick lowers the toll. It does not change who pays it. The charged part of the hazard offers one more opening. Strip the electron off a hydrogen atom, and what remains carries an electric charge, and anything charged can be pushed by a magnetic field. A strong enough field wrapped around the ship could, in theory, bend the oncoming protons aside before they ever reach the hull, a shield made of force instead of matter. The catch is that dust grains and whole neutral atoms carry no charge for the field to grip. The magnetic shield turns away the radiation and waves the bullets through. To stop both, you are back to mass and back to the same vice. Even under the ceiling, the rare catastrophic hit is only half the danger. The other half is the slow grinding of the prow. A ship that holds 1% of light speed for 400 years is sandblasted by gas and dust that entire time, its forward face worn down atom by atom, pit by pit, the way a desert wind hollows a standing stone over centuries. Nothing pointed into the wind survives the crossing unchanged. Sensors cloud, plating thins, the leading edge is quietly eaten. A crew at cruising speed is never done repairing the side of their world that faces where they are going. The front of the ship becomes a wound that has to be dressed for as long as the journey lasts. What turns this over in my head is the direction the threat comes from. We reach for speed as the escape, the one thing that might shrink an impossible distance down to something a life can hold. And the vacuum answers by growing more violent the harder we run. The grain of dust, the lone hydrogen atom, the dark itself, every one of them sits perfectly still and perfectly harmless. We bring the violence by moving. The faster we try to outrun the problem of distance, the harder the crossing works to kill us for trying. So the two pressures close like a vice. Go fast, and the void becomes a weapon while the shielding becomes a wall of mass no engine can move. Go slow, and the journey outlasts every life aboard. There is only a narrow band of speed where a ship survives the crossing at all, a band measured in small fractions of light speed, and every speed inside it is slow enough to swallow generations. The lethality of the fast path is not a separate problem from the relay we found before. It is the same wall seen from another face. The vacuum itself enforces the rule. Cross the dark slowly enough to live, and you cross it across more lives than one. If a modest speed is the only survivable one, perhaps the answer is to settle for it, build the slow ship, and pay in time instead of blood. But even a modest speed hides a cost that owes nothing to dust or radiation. Lifting something the size of a small city to 1% of light speed demands an amount of energy that is hard to say out loud. How much, exactly, and from where on Earth would it ever come? Bringing a single kilogram up to 1% of light speed takes about 4.5 trillion joules. A kilogram is a bag of sugar. 4.5 trillion joules is the energy let loose by a 1 kiloton nuclear blast. To move one bag of sugar to cruising speed, you spend the yield of a small tactical warhead. Now stop picturing a kilogram. A ship that keeps thousands of people alive for centuries is not weighed in kilograms. Give it the kindest figure anyone seriously floats, lighter than most honest proposals admit, and call the whole thing 1,000,000 tons. The habitat, the farms, the water, the reactors, the shielding, the people, 1,000,000 tons. Push that to 1% of light speed, and the energy needed climbs past anything with a human reference left in it. So measure it against everything human at once. Every power plant on Earth, every engine, every furnace and reactor and burning thing our whole civilization runs, all of it together, pouring out energy without a pause, would take somewhere near 7 or 8 years to make that much. And that is the clean version. The physicist's version, with no waste, where every joule lands perfectly in the ship's motion. Reality never grants that. You cannot pour energy into a ship the way you pour water into a glass. A rocket moves by throwing mass out the back, and the fuel it throws has to be carried until the instant it is thrown. So the fuel near the front of the tank must be accelerated by the fuel behind it, which must be accelerated by the fuel behind that. You are not only paying to move the ship, you are paying to move the fuel that moves the fuel that moves the ship. That is the cruelty buried in rocketry, and it grows exponentially. Double the speed you ask for, and you do not double the fuel. You square the problem. Run the arithmetic for an ordinary chemical rocket, the kind that has lifted every satellite we ever launched, and ask it for 1% of light speed. The fuel it would need to carry is not large. It is impossible. The tank required would hold more mass than exists in the entire observable universe. By a margin no words can shrink. Chemical fire cannot reach these speeds. It was never within reach of being close. There is exactly one way out of that exponential trap, and it is not more fuel. It is faster fuel. The punishment eases only when the exhaust leaves the engine at a speed that is itself a real fraction of light speed. That is why fusion and antimatter keep surfacing, and not for glamour. They are the only reactions whose exhaust streams out fast enough to keep the fuel ratio sane. Burn fusion fuel, so its products leave at a few percent of light speed, and a ship needing only a little more fuel than payload becomes thinkable. The catch waits one level down. We have never built a fusion engine that runs, and antimatter has to be made one particle at a time, at an energy cost that dwarfs everything the antimatter later returns. The rocket equation opens a door, and the engineering bricks it half shut. Every figure so far has been for speeding up alone, A ship hurling itself across the dark at 1% of light speed cannot coast into its new home and step out. Nothing out there will slow it down. No atmosphere to brake against, no ground, no hand to catch it. It has to carry its own brakes, firing its engines just as hard in reverse, which calls for a second helping of energy as large as the first. The arrival costs what the departure cost. You pay the wall twice. What unsettles me is not the size of the bill. It is when the bill falls due. All of this energy goes into the ship at the very start, in one enormous push, and then it is gone, turned into motion with nowhere left to drain. After that, the ship only coasts, holding a speed it can no longer change without spending the second fortune it set aside for stopping. The kinetic energy of the ship is the journey, frozen in at the beginning and carried untouched across the centuries. The single most consequential decision of the whole mission, how fast, toward what, committing how many lives, is paid for and locked shut before the first child is ever born aboard. After launch, there is no throttle any hand can reach. So the energy seals what the distance and the dust had already argued. Brute force is not waiting just beyond our current engineering. It is walled off by arithmetic on three sides at once, by the time the crossing takes, by the violence that speed invites, and by the staggering doubled front-loaded price of the speed itself. A faster ship does not rescue you from the generation ship. A faster ship is the generation ship, only more expensive. That is the moment the whole problem stopped belonging to engineers. If no engine can fold the journey down to fit a human life, then the thing left to redesign is not the engine, it is the journey. Stop building a vehicle that carries people across the dark. Build a world that carries itself, and let the people be born, grow old, and pass on inside it as it goes. That leap, from machine to world, is more than 100 years old. And the first person to take it seriously was, fittingly, the same man who first wrote down the equation that makes the fuel impossible. What did he see, staring at this same wall, that let him give up on the engine and reach for a world instead? In a wooden house in the Russian town of Kaluga, more than 120 years ago, a deaf provincial schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky worked out the equation that still governs every rocket ever flown. He had lost most of his hearing to scarlet fever as a boy, taught himself mathematics largely alone, and did his thinking far from any university or laboratory. In 1903, he published the relation between a rocket's fuel and the speed it can reach. The same arithmetic that followed to its end slams the door on crossing to the stars by brute force. He understood that wall better than anyone alive, and he did not stop at the wall. He reasoned straight through it, to a different kind of ship entirely. A vessel meant for a voyage of generations, he saw, could not simply carry its air and its food. It would run out of both. It would have to make them, continuously, on the way. He imagined greenhouses built into the hull, plants drinking the carbon dioxide the crew breathed out and handing back oxygen, roots fed on waste, the whole thing closing into a loop that fed itself. The passengers in that vision stop being cargo riding inside a machine. They become the inhabitants of a tiny, sealed, living world. The thought he kept circling was simple and strange. A planet is a cradle for mind, and nothing alive is meant to stay forever in the cradle that bore it. Follow that loop to its conclusion, and a stranger requirement falls out. If the journey lasts longer than a lifetime, the ship cannot only keep its people alive, it has to let them be replaced. It must carry not just a crew, but the power to make a new crew, and another after that, for as many turns as the dark demands. The moment a ship is asked to reproduce the people inside it, the idea of a passenger quietly dies, and the idea of a population takes its place. That substitution is the whole of the generation ship, hiding inside a sentence about greenhouses. The same conclusion arrived from the far side of the world by a different road. In 1918, an American named Robert Goddard, years before he launched the first liquid-fueled rocket, sat down and wrote a short, sober speculation he called The Last Migration. He was thinking about the death of the sun, billions of years out, and what a species might do when its home star finally failed. His answer was an arc, crossing a gulf so wide that no ordinary lifetime could span it. The travelers carried across in some reduced and sleeping state, or failing that, reduced all the way down to the seed of life itself, to be grown again at the far end. Then he did something quietly telling. He sealed the manuscript away, to be opened by some reader in a future he would never meet. The idea was already behaving like the thing it described, handed forward to a generation not yet born. A decade later, the picture reached its fullest form. In 1929, the British scientist John Desmond Burnell sketched enormous hollow spheres adrift in space, each one a globe perhaps miles across, holding tens of thousands of people inside its inner surface. Burnell's worlds grew their own food, recycled their own air, made their own light, and answered to no planet at all. He saw them slipping free of the sun's pull and simply leaving, carrying their populations outward not as a voyage with a fixed end, but as a new and permanent way of living, a community that had become its own world. In his version, the vehicle disappears completely. There is no ship carrying people any longer. There is only a place, moving. Set the three of them side by side, and the thing they share is not optimism. I used to read this as a story of ambition, of dreamers straining toward the stars. It reads more honestly as a story of surrender. Not one of them solved the engine. Each looked hard at the speeds a body can survive and the fuel a ship can carry, and each conceded, fully, that brute force loses. The generation ship is not the idea you reach for when you believe you can conquer the distance. It is the idea you reach for once you have accepted that you cannot, and you ask, anyway, what sort of thing could still cross? The dream of arriving fast had to die first. Only in the space it left did the slower, heavier, stranger idea have room to grow. When you decide the ship must reproduce its own occupants, you have, without quite saying so, redefined the people as a renewable part of the machinery. A component that replaces itself before it wears out. In a sentence about greenhouses and spheres, it sounds like nothing. Carried forward 300 years and lived inside by real children, it becomes the hardest question the whole enterprise will ever have to answer. The visionaries built the world. They did not look closely at what it would mean to be born as one of its moving parts. I keep landing on Tsiolkovsky, alone in Kaluga, because of the shape of what he did. The same hand that wrote the equation proving the door is shut also drew the only window anyone has found in it, decades before a single rocket left the ground. He could not hear the world clearly. He had no telescope worth the name, and he reasoned his way to both the limit and the loophole from a desk in a small town, on paper. And here is the part that mirrors the idea itself. More than 120 years have passed since he set it down, and not one hull of a real generation ship has ever been laid. The longest we have ever lived, sealed away from Earth, is a space station resupplied from below every few months, continuously crewed only since the year 2000, and not self-sustaining for a single day. The concept has been handed from mind to mind across 4 generations of thinkers, none of whom built it, each trusting the next to carry it a little further. The idea of the generation ship has, so far, only ever traveled the way a generation ship travels, forward, slowly, through people who will not see it arrive. They all agreed on the answer. It must be a world. Which leaves the first hard question anyone actually has to build. How large does a world have to be before it can hold air that moves, ground you can walk, a horizon that does not press in, and thousands of lives without becoming a tomb that simply happens to be flying? Out in deep space, there is no down. No floor, no direction for things to fall, nothing to lean against. A world that wants weight has to manufacture it, and there is only one way to do that without a planet underneath you. You spin. Set a great drum turning. Stand on the inside of its outer wall, and the spin flings you outward against that wall the way water climbs the side of a bucket swung in a circle. The push feels like gravity. It points outward, toward the hull, away from the center. On a spinning ship, down is not beneath the world. Down is the outer skin of it, and the ground you walk on is the inside of the wall holding the vacuum out. Live in a place like that, and the landscape does something your eyes have never had to forgive. The ground curves. Stand in the middle of a long rotating cylinder, and the land does not fall away to a flat horizon. It rises, ahead of you and behind you, sweeping up on both sides until it closes over your head. Look straight up and you do not see sky. You see more ground, fields, rooftops, rivers, people, all of it hanging a mile or two overhead, upside down with respect to you, held to their own piece of floor by the same spin that holds you to yours. The only thing running down the center, where a sky should be, is a long thread of light. The world wraps around you on every side, and you live in the curved bottom of a valley with no top. To make that valley feel like home rather than a carnival ride, it has to be large. Spin a small drum fast enough for full weight, and the human body notices the turning in ways we will come to, and none of them are pleasant. The cure is size. The wider the drum, the slower it can turn for the same weight, and the gentler the spin sits on the people inside. The serious designs are not modest. One early proposal, a ring nearly 2 kilometers across, would turn about once a minute to hold a single gravity. A larger vision, a cylinder 8 kilometers wide and tens of kilometers long, would rotate under half a turn a minute, its rim sweeping past at close to 200 meters every second, while the people on its inner surface felt nothing but ordinary ground beneath their feet. Holding a thing like that together is a quieter kind of violence. A spinning world is a world straining to fly apart. Every gram of hull, every ton of soil and water, is trying to travel in a straight line out into space, and the only thing stopping it is the tensile strength of the structure curving it back. The hull lives in permanent tension, stretched like the wall of an overpressured tank, pulling against itself for as long as it turns. And the bigger you build, the harder it pulls. A spinning hull of ordinary steel begins to approach its own breaking point, somewhere around a few kilometers of radius, just from the effort of holding itself at one gravity, before you have laid down a single field or poured a single lake. There is a real ceiling on how large a spun world can be, and it is written not in imagination but in the strength of materials. Past it, no known substance can hold the weight it is being asked to make. There is something unforgiving folded into that. Spin gravity is not a field you switch on softly and dial down at night. It is stored motion, locked into millions of tons of turning mass, under enormous and unceasing stress. And that stored motion is your weight. The same spin that presses you gently to the floor is the same spin trying, every second, to tear the floor open. The force that holds you down and the force that most wants to destroy the ship are not two forces, they are one. A hull breach in a spinning world does not sigh and leak. The tension it was holding lets go all at once, and the world unzips along the line of the tier. A child raised inside one of these would grow up with the exact reverse of our instincts. Up would mean neighbors hanging overhead, not emptiness. A horizon that climbed instead of fell would be the only honest horizon there is. Show that child a recording of Earth, a real open sky with nothing above the clouds, and it might read not as freedom but as a sheer drop into a bottomless nothing, a sky that forgot to curve back and catch you. Our sense of what a normal world looks like turns out to be a habit of living on the outside of a very large ball, rather than the inside of a much smaller one. Move people to the inside, and within a generation the habit reverses. What we call the open sky, they might call the abyss. All of that, though, is the still picture. The architecture, standing there, turning, holding its shape. The world inside that drum only stays simple as long as nobody moves. The spin that makes your weight is doing something to every direction at once, and the moment you walk, or pour a glass of water, or simply turn your head too quickly, the turning of the floor reaches up and pushes on you sideways in a way no floor on Earth ever has. The architecture can be built. The harder question is what it does to the soft, fluid, balance-keeping machinery inside a human skull, when the ground itself will not hold still. Deep inside each of your ears, behind the part that hears, sit 3 tiny loops of fluid set at right angles to one another. They are your sense of turning. When your head rotates, the fluid in those loops lags behind for an instant and bends a cluster of fine hairs, and those hairs tell your brain which way you just moved. It is an exquisite instrument, tuned across hundreds of millions of years of animals living on ground that stayed put. You carry, in your skull, a gyroscope you cannot switch off, and a spinning world is precisely the place that gyroscope was never built to read. Stand still inside the turning drum and the loops report nothing wrong. The floor presses up, your weight feels honest, all is calm. Then you turn your head. The world is already rotating around its axis, and now your head is rotating too, on a different axis, and the two motions cross. The fluid in those little loops gets pushed in a direction that corresponds to no real movement you made. Your inner ear sends your brain a crisp, confident signal that the entire room has just pitched and rolled, while your eyes insist it has not. That contradiction, between an ear that says tumbling and an eye that says steady, is the exact recipe for nausea. The same mismatch that turns a ship's cabin or the back seat of a car into a misery, delivered every time you glance over your shoulder. The spin leaks into ordinary movements too. Pour a glass of water and the stream does not fall straight. It slants, nudged sideways by the turning of the world as it drops. Walk in the same direction the drum is spinning and you feel faintly heavier. Walk against the spin and you feel a little lighter, your steps suddenly springier for no reason your legs can name. Climb a ladder toward the central axis, and an invisible hand presses you sideways the whole way up. None of it is large in a big enough habitat. All of it is constant. The floor of a spun world carries a permanent, gentle bias that no floor on Earth has ever had. There is only one real cure, and it is the one we already met: size. The sickness comes from the rate of the spin, not the strength of the gravity. So the trick is to turn slowly and make up the weight with a wider circle. Keep the rotation under roughly 2 turns a minute, slow enough that most people stop feeling ill, and to reach full Earth weight at that lazy a pace, the floor has to lie at least a couple of 100 meters out from the center. That single requirement, born entirely in the fluid of the human ear, is why these worlds cannot be small. The body sets the minimum size of the ship. The architecture bends around a few loops of liquid in a person's head. Even at that size, the gravity is never quite even. Weight in a spinning world grows with distance from the axis, which means your feet, standing farther out, are always a touch heavier than your head. On Earth, your whole body shares one weight without thinking about it. Here, weight is a number that depends on how far out you are standing, and it changes as you climb or lie down. Stretch out to sleep, and your head and your feet rest at slightly different gravities. It is a small thing. It is also a small, ceaseless reminder that the pull holding you to the floor was manufactured, and that you are living inside the machine that makes it. Under all of this sits a question we genuinely cannot answer. Every human body that has ever existed grew up at one gravity, the Earth's, or briefly at almost none, in orbit. We have no data from anywhere in between. No child has ever been conceived, carried, born, or raised a skeleton in partial gravity. We do not know the least amount of gravity a developing human body needs to come out whole. We know what its absence does. Astronauts in orbit lose as much as 1% of their bone every month. Their muscles thin. Their hearts reshape themselves for a world with no down. Full spin gravity should hold most of that off. But a habitat that settles for less than full weight, to spin slower or be built smaller, is making a wager with no evidence behind it, on bodies that will spend a lifetime inside the bet. The generation ship is, among everything else it is, the first long experiment in whether a human being can even be grown correctly away from Earth, and it runs that experiment on children who were never asked. The honest part of all this is the body itself. It is the one instrument aboard that cannot be argued into believing the floor. The founders, who grew up on real ground, will feel the forgery as a wrongness in the stomach. They will know, at a level below thought, that the world is lying about how it moves, and some of them will be quietly sick for years before they adapt, if they ever fully do. Their children will feel none of it. An inner ear calibrated from infancy to a turning world treats the Coriolis tug as simply how floors behave, the way you treat the ordinary pull of Earth without once noticing it. To them, the slanting water and the sideways nudge are not symptoms. They are the plain facts of a floor. Set such a child on a still, unspinning surface, the kind every one of us calls solid ground, and it might be the still floor that feels subtly, dreadfully wrong. The lie the first generation struggles against becomes the only truth the next one ever knows. They would still be human, recognizably so. They would simply be tuned, from the cells of the ear outward, to a world that would make you and me ill to stand in. A body can learn to forgive a slanting glass of water. Given a generation, it can be rebuilt around it entirely. What no body can adapt to, what no amount of calibration in the inner ear will ever soften, is the absence of the next breath. The spinning world can hold you to its floor for 100 years without fail. It still has to give you something to put in your lungs, over and over, for centuries, out of a supply that can never be opened from outside. So where, in a sealed world, does the air keep coming from? The air comes from a loop, not a tank. It has to. And the reason is in the numbers your own body runs every day. A grown person pulls in something like 0.8 of a kilogram of oxygen a day and breathes out close to a kilogram of carbon dioxide. Multiply one quiet breath by 1,000 people, then by 365 days, then by 400 years, and the oxygen alone runs past 100,000 tons. You cannot carry that. A tank only empties. Breathe from a stored supply, and you are watching a number fall, every hour, that nothing will ever lift again. The only way to keep a sealed world breathing is to take the carbon dioxide coming out of every person and turn it back into oxygen, continuously, forever, faster than the crew can use it up. The reverse reaction is the one green things do. A plant takes in carbon dioxide and light and hands back oxygen, the exact opposite of what your lungs are doing. So the air becomes a ledger. Every breath is a withdrawal. Every leaf is a deposit. And the account cannot merely balance on average over a year. It has to balance hour by hour, with no overdraft, no outside deposit, and no branch to call when the figures drift. A normal supply of oxygen has slack in it, a ledger that must close perfectly every hour for centuries has none. The first surprise is which column kills you. Run low on oxygen, and the body protests slowly. But the carbon dioxide you exhale is poisonous well before the oxygen runs short. The air you breathe now is about 0.04% carbon dioxide. Push that to a single percent and people grow dull and headachy over a day. Push it to a few percent and thinking fails, then consciousness. In a sealed room full of people, the danger is not that you slowly run out of air to breathe. It is that you drown, gently, in the air you have already breathed, long before the oxygen is gone. The ledger has two columns, and the one that fails fastest is the one you would least expect to watch. We know this is not theory, because we have tried it once, at real scale, and watched the air go wrong. In the Arizona desert in 1991, 8 people sealed themselves inside a glass and steel world called Biosphere 2. 3 acres of farm and forest and miniature ocean, the most ambitious closed habitat anyone has ever built. They meant to live 2 years inside it, breathing only what their own plants made. Within about 16 months, the oxygen began to slide. From the ordinary 21% of normal air, it fell and fell, down toward 14. 14% oxygen is the air of a mountain pass higher than almost any town on Earth, and the crew were living in it at sea level, gasping on the stairs, sleeping badly, minds gone slow. In the end, they gave up the seal and pumped oxygen in from outside. The reason the oxygen vanished is the part that should keep a ship designer awake. It did not leak. The world was sealed, and the oxygen was still disappearing. They had filled the place with rich, living soil, and that soil was packed with microbes, and the microbes breathed far harder than anyone had counted on, eating oxygen and pouring out carbon dioxide at a furious rate. That alone the plants might have answered, turning the carbon dioxide back into oxygen. But the carbon dioxide never reached them. The fresh concrete in the structure was still curing, and curing concrete drinks carbon dioxide, pulling it out of the air and locking it into the walls as solid stone. The carbon was taken out of the loop before the plants could close it, and the oxygen went with it. The missing breath of 8 people was eventually found, chemically bound, sitting inside the concrete of the building. Nothing in that failure was a broken machine. No pump seized, no scrubber clogged, no sensor died. Every piece of equipment worked exactly as designed. The air went wrong because 2 things nobody had modeled, hungry soil and thirsty concrete, quietly teamed up along a path that appeared in no plan and on no gauge. The ledger balanced on paper. It drained anyway, into a place no one had thought to watch. I have stopped picturing this kind of failure as suffocation. It looks more like an accounting error that no one catches until the room is already thin. The frightening version of losing your air is not an alarm and a hiss and a scramble for masks. It is a slow, invisible drift while every gauge someone thought to install keeps reading normal, because the oxygen is not escaping through any hole. It is changing into something else and hiding where no instrument is pointed. The danger you can prepare for is rarely the one that finds you. The one that finds you is the reaction nobody knew to write down. And Biosphere 2 had every advantage a generation ship will not. It ran for 2 years, not 400. It sat on the surface of a living planet with a sky full of free oxygen one broken pane away. When the air failed, they opened a valve to the whole atmosphere of Earth and saved themselves. A ship between the stars has no valve. The atmosphere it leaves with is the only atmosphere it will ever have, balanced not for 2 years but for centuries, by a loop that must be inherited intact, generation after generation, by people who never set it up and cannot see most of what it does. They would be breathing the outcome of chemistry their great-grandparents started and no living person fully tracks. Here is what that desert really proved. The problem was never the machinery, and on a ship, it never will be. You can build flawless pumps and perfect scrubbers and still lose the very air in your lungs, because the thing keeping you alive is not a machine at all. It is a living system, with a metabolism of its own, doing things its makers never ordered and cannot always find. Which raises the question underneath every sealed world ever imagined. Can you actually engineer something alive, the way you engineer an engine? Or can you only build it a home, set it running, and hope it keeps its half of the bargain? A machine can make oxygen. The space station overhead does it right now, splitting water with electricity into oxygen to breathe and hydrogen to throw away, scrubbing the carbon dioxide out of the air with chemical filters. No plants required. So the obvious move is to skip the fragile garden and let machines run the air, the way machines run everything else we trust our lives to. 2 things stop that plan cold. A machine cannot feed you, and a machine cannot fix itself. You can split water for oxygen, but you cannot split feedstock into a meal. Food has to be either carried, which is hopeless across centuries, or grown, which means agriculture, which means soil and microbes and roots and pollination and the slow turning of nutrients from waste back into harvest. The moment you grow food, you have a living system on your hands whether you wanted one or not. And a living system, unlike a machine, does many jobs at once and asks for nothing. It makes oxygen while it makes dinner, cleans water while it cycles waste, and when something tears, it can, under the right conditions, knit itself back together. No machine repairs its own broken parts. No machine grows a replacement for itself out of sunlight and dirt. Biology is the only technology we know of that heals and reproduces on its own. Over 400 years with no resupply, that is not a nice feature. It is the whole game. So there are 2 ways to keep people alive in a sealed box, and they fail in opposite directions. A machine you understand completely and control completely, and it wears steadily towards zero, feeding no one on the way down. A living world feeds you, heals itself, and runs for free, and no one understands it completely, and no one controls it at all. The generation ship is forced to choose the second kind, the one we comprehend least, for the exact reason that it is the only kind that lasts. You must hand your survival to the thing you can least predict, because the thing you can predict will run out. And a living world is not a row of tidy services you can switch on one at a time. It is a web. The plants make oxygen, but only if something carries their pollen. The pollinators live only if the right flowers bloom in the right order. The soil feeds the plants only if unseen armies of microbes are breaking the dead back down into nutrients, and those microbes hold only if the moisture and the acidity and the temperature stay inside narrow bands. Pull one thread and the whole cloth shifts, often somewhere you were not looking. This is not a flaw you can engineer away. It is what being alive means. The parts are not independent. They are married to each other, all of them, all the time. The Arizona experiment showed this too, past the failing oxygen. Inside that sealed world, the insects that carried pollen died out. every species of them, and once they were gone, many of the plants could no longer make seed. Meanwhile, the creatures nobody invited thrived. Stowaway ants and cockroaches bred into the millions. A fast vine, planted on purpose to soak up carbon dioxide, turned invasive and smothered the food crops, so the people spent their days tearing it back by hand. The tiny artificial ocean turned acid. The 8 people inside grew chronically, gnawingly hungry, and over 2 years the men lost close to 1/5 of their body weight. The web did not die. That is the part to hold on to. It reorganized. It found a new arrangement that worked perfectly well as an ecosystem and barely at all as a farm. It did not fail at being alive. It succeeded at being alive, and being alive turned out to mean something other than obeying the blueprint. A living system does not wear toward zero like a machine. It wears toward a new balance, one that suits itself, and it owes the people depending on it nothing whatsoever. You can want the system to be a garden of wheat and tomatoes. The system wants only to be stable, and stable may have no wheat in it at all. Set against that, our confidence looks thin. Earth's own ecology has been studied by millions of people for centuries, and we still cannot fully predict a single lake, a single forest, a single season of one field. A closed habitat is an entire ecology assembled by hand, out of incomplete knowledge, because complete knowledge of a living system has never existed and may not be possible. You cannot test such a thing the way you test an engine, part by part, before you trust it. Its real behavior only appears once the whole of it is running, all at once, coupled, alive, and by then you are already living inside the answer, out where help does not come. What changes for me is the verb. You do not run a living world, you tend it. The crew of a generation ship are not operators standing at a console, throwing switches on a system that does as it is told. They are keepers of a creature, and the creature is keeping them alive while it goes about its own business. A gardener can guide and prune and coax and feed. A gardener cannot command. The bargain is a relationship, not a control panel, with something far more capable than any machine and entirely indifferent to whether you make it to the next star. Engineering promises mastery. This asks for humility instead, and it does not ask politely. There is one more thing the web does that the people inside can never stop. It drifts. The ecology a child is born into 100 years out is not the ecology their great-grandparents sealed at launch. It has spent every one of those years quietly becoming something else, shedding species, gaining others, settling into balances no founder chose. The world inside the hull is alive in the fullest sense, which means it is changing, the whole way across, exactly as its people are. The ship is not a container for a living thing. The ship is a living thing, with the crew folded inside it. And of every thread running through that creature, one loops the tightest and the most intimately of all. The same water has to move through the soil, into the plants, up into the air, down into the cup, through every body aboard, and back again, over and over, for centuries, never leaving, never refreshed. What is it, then, to lift a glass and drink water that has already been inside everyone you have ever known and everyone they ever knew, all the way back to the people who first sealed the doors? Begin with the thing that makes people flinch, and take the flinch away first. The water on such a ship would be cleaner than almost anything you have ever drunk on Earth. It is cleaner because of exactly what was done to it. You boil it to vapor and leave the impurities behind. You pass that vapor over surfaces that burn away anything organic. You push what remains through filters fine enough to strain out single molecules that are not water. What comes out the far end is water, and almost nothing else, purer than rain, purer than any river, purer than what runs from the tap in most of the world. The station orbiting overhead already lives this way, recovering close to all of its water from the crew's breath and sweat and urine, and the people up there drink it without a second thought because there is nothing left in it to think twice about. So the revulsion is in the mind, not in the glass. A molecule of water remembers nothing. Two hydrogen atoms bound to one of oxygen are the same two hydrogen atoms bound to one of oxygen whether they spent last week in a cloud, in a leaf, or inside another person's body. The substance is innocent of its own history. Once it is clean, it is simply water, carrying no trace of where it has been. And here is the part we never feel on Earth. Every glass of water you have ever swallowed already held molecules that passed through storms and oceans and other people, through animals long dead, through the bodies of strangers you will never meet. It has always been true, we just never sense it, because Earth's water is an ocean of a pool, turning over slowly across millions of years, and the everyone in it is spread so thin and so far back in time that it vanishes. The fact is real and it weighs nothing. On a ship, that dilution is gone. The pool is small, the loop is quick, and the everyone in your cup is no longer ancient and nameless. It is recent. It has a face. The water you lift this morning was, 2 weeks ago, moving through the bodies of the specific people down the corridor. The gardener, the child 2 doors over, the person who died last month in the clinic. Not as a statistic spread across an ocean and an age, as a small, closed, recent fact. Water is the one thing the whole world inside the hull holds in common. It is the medium everything else moves in. Sap climbs through it, blood runs on it, nutrients ride it into the roots and waste rides it back out. The habitat has, in the end, a single circulatory system, and every living thing in it, every plant, every person, every unseen microbe in the soil, is a temporary eddy where the common water slows for a while before moving on. You are not a separate vessel that water passes through. You are a place the ship's water happens to be standing, for now, in the shape of a person. Both things are true at once, and the ship makes you live inside the gap between them. At the level of atoms, this is the deepest closeness imaginable. You are continuous, molecule by molecule, with everyone aboard, joined through the water the way the cells of one body are joined through blood. At the level of substance, it is nothing at all, because the water keeps no memory and tells you none of it. The intimacy is total and weightless together. The line between yourself and everyone else turns out to be, in large part, a question of where the shared water is resting this particular week. Follow that far enough, and the dead are in the cup too. The founders who pulled the doors shut at the beginning are gone, their bodies long finished, but the water that ran through them never left the ship. It could not. Nothing leaves. So, it is still here, somewhere in the loop, and some of it is in your hand right now. The children who have not been born yet are already promised the same water, the only water there will ever be. To drink, on a ship like this, is a quiet communion with the people who started the voyage and the ones who will end it, all of them dispersed through a single closed supply. Not as a feeling laid on top, as plain conservation of mass. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. So everyone who has ever lived aboard is still present, thinned into the water, sharing it with everyone who ever will. Of everything waiting on that ship, this is the only piece I have never been able to file under danger. It is closeness instead of threat, a confinement that does not press in but dissolves outward, folding the single life quietly into the long one, whether the single life agreed to it or not. The same ceiling that traps these people also makes them, in the most literal way, parts of one another, drinking and breathing and growing from a shared body of water that knows no edge between them. It may be the one mercy hidden in the whole hard design. But the mercy only holds while the world stays sealed. The closeness, the shared water, the single gentle body the ship becomes, all of it depends on the wall between inside and outside holding firm. And the wall is not perfectly firm. Beyond it lies something that does not loop, does not share, and does not care, pouring steadily through the hull every second of the voyage, touching the water and the soil and the bodies alike, and leaving in them a kind of damage no filter can strain out and no clean glass can undo. What is it, exactly, that the dark is pushing through the walls, that the recycled water can never wash away? What comes through the wall is the shattered cores of other stars. Across the galaxy, dying stars and worse have been flinging atoms apart for billions of years, stripping nuclei bare and hurling them outward at very nearly the speed of light. They fill the space between the stars in every direction at once, a thin, ceaseless rain of bare atomic nuclei called cosmic rays. Most are simple protons, the cores of hydrogen. A small fraction are heavier, whole iron nuclei among them, and those few are the real danger. They do not knock politely. They arrive with so much energy that ordinary matter is, to them, barely there. On Earth, you never meet them. A planet wraps you in two shields at once, a magnetic field that turns the charged ones aside, and an atmosphere that stacks something like 10 tons of air over every square meter of ground, soaking the rest up long before it reaches you. Out between the stars there is neither. There is the hull, which by the standards of a cosmic ray is a sheet of paper, and behind the hull there is you. The particles pass through the wall, and then through the body, the way sunlight passes through a pane of glass. The damage is done in the passing. A cosmic ray tears electrons off the atoms it brushes as it goes, snapping the chemical bonds that hold molecules together. When one of those molecules is a strand of your DNA, the strand breaks. Most breaks the cell finds and mends within hours. Some it mends wrong. A few it cannot mend at all. Each error is small. Stacked across decades and trillions of cells, the errors become the things we have names for. A cell that dies. A cell that forgets how to stop dividing, which is the beginning of a cancer. A change written into an egg or a sperm, which is a change handed to a child. A heavy nucleus does something worse than a simple proton, and it is worth being exact about why. Medical radiation, an X-ray, spreads its energy thinly, a scattering of small hits a cell can usually shrug off. An iron nucleus at these speeds does not scatter. It drives a single dense track straight through tissue, wrecking a whole column of cells along one line, leaving damage so clustered and tangled that the repair machinery cannot read it well enough to fix it. This is why the dark between the stars is not just more radiation than a hospital. It is a harsher kind that the body has no good answer for. And most of the harm comes through the very thing that, last night, was your closeness. A cosmic ray rarely strikes a strand of DNA head-on. The cell is mostly water, so the particle mostly hits water, splitting those molecules into violently reactive fragments that then go looking for something to attack, and what they find is the DNA. You are made largely of water, which means you are made largely of target. The same shared water that joined everyone aboard into one gentle body becomes, under this rain, the medium that carries the wound inward. The intimacy and the injury run through the exact same substance. Every other danger on this ship, at least, has the decency to announce itself. Thin air makes you gasp. Low gravity turns your stomach. Hunger speaks plainly. This one says nothing. You feel no heat, no sting, no warning as a nucleus passes through your chest and rearranges a molecule you will never miss. The only record is written deep in cells you cannot inspect, and in the eggs and the sperm that become the next generation, surfacing years later as a rate of cancer, lifetimes later as a count of mutations. A danger you can feel, you can fear honestly, in real time. A danger with no sensation has to be taken entirely on faith, believed against every signal the body is sending, which is none at all. You spend a whole life inside a harm you are never once allowed to feel. You can stop some of it, and the way you stop it returns us to the water. The defense against radiation is mass, plain matter standing between you and the dark, but not just any matter. Heavy metals are a trap. A cosmic ray striking lead or thick aluminum can shatter the metal's own nuclei and throw off a spray of secondary particles that is worse than what came in. What works is matter full of hydrogen, and the cheapest, most abundant hydrogen-rich material a ship already carries is water. So the crew hide behind their own drinking supply, the same water they breathe out and recycle and pass between their bodies, stacked into the walls to break the cosmic rays apart gently. The trouble is the amount. Real protection takes meters of it, tons over every square meter of surface, and that mass runs straight into the walls we already met, the strength of the hull and the staggering cost of moving more weight. You cannot wrap the whole world that thickly, so you build one heavily armored core to flee into when a storm is coming, and everywhere else you accept a slow, constant dose, soaking in, year after year. The founders spent their childhoods on Earth, shielded by a whole planet, and only began absorbing the dark as grown adults with decades left. The people who finally arrive are born late, near journey's end, where a star and the shadow of a planet offer some cover again. It is the generations in the middle who are conceived, who grow, who age and die entirely in the deepest dark, farthest from any star, in the heaviest rain, through the most fragile and radiation-sensitive years of a developing body, and who then pass the accumulated damage forward into children who absorb their own share on top of it. The radiation bill of the entire crossing comes due, most heavily, on the people who will see neither the world that was left nor the world that is reached. There is one more thing this silent rain is doing, slowly, that the first night already hinted at. A steady pressure of mutation on the germline, generation after generation, is precisely the mechanism by which a population stops being quite what it was. The dark is not only killing individual cells, across enough lifetimes, atom by atom, break by break, it is editing the lineage itself, nudging the descendants a little further from the people who left, in a direction no one chose and no one can read until it has already happened. Every wall against this runs on power. The water that shields, the core to shelter in, the lights that keep the plants making air, the warmth held against a cold near absolute, all of it draws without pause on a single source that has to burn for centuries and never go out. A fire that must outlast not only the people who lit it, but their children and their children's children. Where does a flame like that come from, and who keeps feeding it once everyone who understood it is gone? The flame is nuclear. Everything else fails the moment you ask it to burn for centuries. Chemical fuel holds far too little energy for its weight. Sunlight, the thing that powers all life on Earth, is useless once you are far from any star, fading to nothing in the dark between them. Fusion, the reaction that lights the stars themselves, we have never managed to run in a way that gives back more than it takes. Antimatter cannot be stored. What is left is fission, the splitting of heavy atoms, and the reason it survives the cut is density. A few tons of uranium hold the energy of whole mountains of coal, packed small enough to carry across the Gulf. The demand it has to meet is relentless. Out beyond every sun, the plants that make the air cannot photosynthesize by starlight, so the sun has to be replaced by lamps, and lamps for a forest draw enormous power. The cold outside sits only a few degrees above the lowest temperature the universe permits, and warmth has to be made and held against it without pause. The pumps that move the water, the systems that clean it, the fields that turn behind their shielding, the shelters, the workshops, the minds of the computers, all of it pulls on one source. The ship needs the steady output of a city, with no grid behind it, no other plant to lean on, for longer than nations last. We already build reactors that run for decades untouched. The ones inside submarines and aircraft carriers burn a single load of fuel for 25, even 30 years, sealed away, never refueled across the whole working life of the vessel. That is a genuine marvel, and it is nowhere near enough. A crossing of 400 years is 12 to 16 of those lifetimes laid end to end. So the reactor cannot be one sealed device humming quietly in the dark. It has to be fed by reactors clever enough to breed more fuel out of common material as they run. And it has to be rebuilt, its worn parts cut out and replaced, its vessel tended, century after century, by people fabricating the pieces from raw stock as the old ones fail. And here, the surprise arrives, the same one that keeps surfacing on this ship. The physics is the easy part. Uranium will sit in its rods and be uranium billions of years from now. The reactions are lawful and patient. The metal, the fuel, the splitting of the atom. These are the reliable elements of the whole arrangement. The fragile element, the one that has never once been guaranteed across centuries, is the part made of people. A reactor is not run by a machine. It is run by understanding, held inside trained human minds. The people who build it know not just which valve to turn, but why, what the machine is doing underneath, what a strange reading means and what it does not. They train apprentices, who become the experts, who train the next. But understanding loses something at every handoff. The builders who knew the reasons are gone within a generation or two. Their successors inherit the steps. Their successors inherit the steps with the reasons worn thin, a subtlety that was never written down, because to the first experts it was too obvious to bother writing, can simply vanish in 3 generations, and no one left will know it was ever there. A reactor tended by people who know the procedure but have lost the principle runs perfectly well, right up until the day something happens, the procedure never anticipated. It cannot reason about a situation it was never written for. And the fire that keeps everyone breathing is, by then, in the hands of people performing motions whose purpose they no longer hold, doing the right things for reasons they have forgotten, until the moment the right things are no longer enough. A traveler that is really a relay, a line of hands passing one purpose forward through the dark, sounded almost gentle when the purpose was simply to keep going. At the reactor, it has no give in it at all. The understanding has to pass cleanly from technician to apprentice across 16 handoffs, or 50, with not one of them dropped. One generation that keeps the steps and loses the reasons, a single fumbled handoff in a chain centuries long, and the margin is gone. The reactor is the one place on the ship where the chain of hands cannot afford to slip even once, and chains of human hands have never been that perfect. I went looking for a precedent. I could not find one. Every craft we have ever had has drifted. Techniques have been lost and painfully rediscovered. Recipes for materials the ancients made have gone dark for centuries. Understanding that whole civilizations depended on has decayed into half-remembered procedure and then into nothing, And every time, what saved us was that the knowledge survived somewhere else. In another country, another library, another living tradition we could go back to. A generation ship has no somewhere else. There is no other library, no neighboring tradition, no outside to recover from. The reactor asks the crew to do the one thing our species has never once managed in all its history, and to do it with everyone's life resting on the result. So understanding joins the strange list this ship keeps. It is not enough to keep the people alive and the ecology turning. The crew must keep their knowledge alive too, reproduce it mind to mind exactly as they reproduce themselves. And knowledge, it turns out, is the most perishable cargo of all. It cannot be frozen or stored or sealed in a tank. It lives only in people, and people, on this ship, are always being replaced. The reactor is only the loudest example. It ages, and its keeper's understanding ages, but so does everything else around them. The hull, the pipes, the seams, the very metal of the world is wearing down from the first day, and out here there is no factory beyond the wall to build a new one. Everything humans make eventually fails. So the question underneath the whole vessel is a hard one. Can anything we build survive for centuries when the civilization that knew how to build it is 400 years and 100 trillion miles away? Nothing built lasts forever, but the truth about this ship is sharper than that. The ship does not break, it ages. Those are different fates. Breaking is an event, a sudden failure you can guard against with care and backups and warning lights. Aging is a process, and a process cannot be guarded against. It can only be slowed. From the first day of the voyage, before a single thing has gone wrong, the world is already dying, quietly, on a schedule no maintenance can cancel. The dying takes a dozen ordinary forms. The hull of a spinning world lives under permanent tension, and every flex, every thermal swing as it turns, every vibration drives the metal through another cycle of stress. Stress cycles breed microscopic cracks, and cracks grow, slowly, invisibly, until one day a piece of metal that passed every inspection fails anyway, below the strength it had when new. We learned this the hard way on Earth, when the first jet airliners began falling out of the sky in the 1950s, undone by metal fatigue around their windows that no one had known to look for. Under constant load, the metal also creeps, deforming permanently, a fraction at a time, across the years. A warm, wet, oxygen-rich, living habitat is a corrosive place, and the same microbes that keep the soil alive will quietly eat at metal given the chance. The reactor's neutrons make its own vessel brittle. The cosmic rays that age the crew age the plastics and the circuits alongside them. The forward face is sandblasted thinner every century. Every one of these is cumulative. Not one of them reverses on its own. Surely, you think, a ship that can build its own parts escapes this. Make a new beam when the old one cracks, and run forever. It does not work, and the reason is exact. Recycling is taxed. Every time you melt a worn part down and reforge it, a little is lost to oxidation, to contamination, to the simple spillage of the process. Atoms are conserved, but usable material is not. And some things, once lost, are lost for good. The rare elements scattered through a failed catalyst, the trace metal vented to space in an accident, cannot be conjured back from the general stock. The ship is slowly spending down its supply of usable order, and there is a horizon, set by no single part, but by the patient sum of all this loss, beyond which no amount of repair can keep the whole thing whole. What is happening here has a name, and it is the deepest law we know. The universe runs downhill, from order toward disorder, and that slide is called entropy. Left alone, everything arranged comes apart. Heat spreads out, structures crumble, the sorted becomes the jumbled. The only way to hold a thing in order against that current is to spend energy, continuously, doing the work of repair, and even then you never win. You only delay. The current never stops pulling. A generation ship is stripped to its bones. A 4-century act of pushing back against entropy with no resupply. A small island of fierce order held together by relentless effort in an ocean that wants it dissolved. And this is exactly what a living body is. You are a pocket of astonishing order, held against the same current by a metabolism that never rests, replacing your cells, mending your tissues, spending energy every second to keep yourself from coming apart. A body ages for one reason underneath all the others. The repair, over time, falls a little behind the damage. Errors accumulate faster than they are fixed, and the gap, year by year, widens until the system can no longer hold. The ship ages for the identical reason, by the identical law. It is not that the ship is like a body. In the only sense that matters here, it is a body, an open system burning energy to stay ahead of its own decay and slowly losing the race. The crew and the hull around them are two instances of the same process, two pockets of order, aging together at the same time by the same rule. The ship made me notice something about my own body. Staying alive is not a condition you are in. It is a labor, performed without pause, that you are always, very slowly, losing. We feel like stable things moving through time. We are closer to flames, holding a shape only because we are being fed, certain to go out the moment the feeding stops. The ship simply makes visible, at the scale of a city and the span of centuries, what every body hides inside a single lifetime. So the real work of the crew was never to operate a vessel. It is to nurse one. Theirs is the unending care of a patient the size of a town, a patient that cannot be cured and cannot be sent to any hospital, only kept comfortable and functioning a little longer through failures that grow more frequent as the decades pass, with nothing beyond the wall to help. They are not engineers running a machine. They are the geriatric ward of a dying world, and the world is also their only home. The founders launched something gleaming and new. The people who finally arrive, if they arrive, will bring a battered thing limping into harbor. The generations in the middle never see either. They are born into a middle-aged ship, already worn, already patched in 100 places, its prime behind it and its failures slowly multiplying, and they spend their whole lives as its nurses, keeping the tired world breathing long enough to hand it, a little more worn, to children who will nurse it further. They inherit a world in progress, exactly as each of us inherits a body and an earth already old when we arrive, and they tend it knowing they will never see it whole and will never see it finished. A body can be nursed. A ship can be patched. Care can hold off the decay of metal and the decay of flesh alike for a long time by sheer effort. But there is a second body on this voyage that ages by a different law entirely, one that answers to no workshop and no clinic. The people are not only individuals wearing out, together they are a population, a single living lineage, and a lineage can thin and drift and fail in ways no manufacturing can mend, because there is no melting down and reforging a gene that has been lost. What is it then that wears out in a whole people, that no repair shop aboard could ever replace? What wears out in a whole people is variety. Genetic variety, the spread of small differences from one person to the next, and unlike a cracked beam or a worn seal, you cannot fabricate more of it. There is no workshop that makes a gene the crew failed to bring. A population is a system like any other on the ship, and its health is measured not in how many bodies it holds, but in how much difference those bodies carry between them. And in a closed group, with no one new ever arriving, that difference only ever goes one direction: down. So the question that sounds simplest on the whole voyage hides the deepest trap. How many people do you bring? It sounds like a question about space and supplies, about how many bunks you can build and how many mouths the farms can feed. It is really a question about deep time and luck. The number is not set by the size of the ship. It is set by the length of the journey, and by how much erosion 4 centuries of random chance will grind out of a small, sealed pool of genes. You are not asking how many will fit. You are asking how many it takes to survive 400 years of bad luck without coming apart. 2 different things have to be satisfied at once, and they pull on different timescales. The first is simple survival of the group. Enough people that an accident or an outbreak killing a dozen does not cripple the mission, and enough that every vital skill has backups. You need someone who understands the reactor, and someone ready when that person dies, and someone after that. The same for the doctors, the farmers, the keepers of the water. A handful of specialists is a single failure away from disaster. The second requirement runs far longer and far quieter. Enough genetic diversity that cousins are not. Generation after generation, marrying cousins, surfacing the hidden flaws that close breeding brings, while the slow leak of variety over centuries does not hollow the pool out from the inside. Now the honest part, because this is a place where people genuinely disagree. Ask how few you can bring, and some serious analyses land near 100 or 2. Others insist on 10,000 or more. That is not a small gap to wave away. It is the difference between a large village and a small city, between a ship you might almost build and one you almost certainly cannot. And the disagreement is not a sign that someone did the arithmetic wrong. It is the most revealing thing in the whole question. The low number and the high number are not answers to the same question. They are answers to different questions, wearing the same words. A crew of 100 can carry a viable gene pool only if you control, tightly and across every generation, who has children with whom, pairing people like a breeding program to wring the most diversity out of the fewest bodies. The figure of 10,000 assumes something else entirely: people living and loving freely, choosing their own partners, and a population large enough to lose a fifth of itself to some disaster and still recover. The span between 100 and 10,000 is not a margin of error. It is the distance between a managed herd and a free people with room to absorb tragedy. Underneath all of it sits a number almost no one outside the field thinks about, and it is the one that actually decides the outcome. The gene pool does not count heads. It counts who passes their genes forward, and how evenly the passing is spread. A crowd of 1,000 in which a few large families have most of the children, while many people have none, behaves genetically like a far smaller group, sometimes only a few hundred. The number that determines whether the lineage holds is hidden inside the visible crowd, always smaller than the head count, and far harder to control, because it depends on the most private patterns of who pairs with whom and who has children at all. You can count the passengers walking aboard. You cannot easily count the gene pool, and the gene pool is what survives or fails, which quietly turns a logistics problem into something heavier. The smallest survivable crew is only survivable if you are willing to manage the most intimate choices of everyone who comes after. Bring few, and you must, in some form, dictate who may pair with whom for generations, because the diversity is too thin to leave to the heart. Bring many, and you need a ship and an energy budget that may be out of reach forever. Crew size and personal freedom are tied together by a hard rope. The fewer founders you launch, the less freedom their descendants will be allowed in the one choice people guard most fiercely. The founding number is a question about liberty, disguised as a question about logistics. Most mistakes argue with you. This one waits. Launch with too few, and nothing goes wrong for a long time. The pool is healthy at first. The founders look around at a thriving, growing crew and conclude they chose well, and they go to their graves believing it. The error sleeps for generations, accumulating in silence, and then surfaces lifetimes later as rising rates of inherited disease, as fertility quietly falling, as a lineage beginning to fail in ways no one can trace to a decision made centuries earlier. By the time the verdict arrives, you cannot add what you did not bring. The people who made the choice are long dead. The people who pay for it never had a say. It is, once again, a mistake that can only be inherited, and this time it is written into the cells. And beneath even the question of how many lies a stranger one still. Whoever walks up the ramp on the last day does not merely make up the crew. They become the entire genetic future of a whole branch of humanity, for as long as it lasts. Every trait the descendants will ever carry, every gift and every weakness, every color of eye and turn of mind and hidden vulnerability is drawn from the small handful who happened aboard. The future of these people is not designed, and it is not chosen. It is sampled, once, from whoever is standing on the ramp the day the doors close. How much of everything their descendants will ever be is decided, permanently, by who that small group happens to be. Nearly all of it. That is the honest answer, and there is a name for the reason: the founder effect. It is among the most dependable facts in all of population genetics. Start a new population from a small group, and that group carries only a slice of the variety the larger population held. Whatever frequencies the founders happen to have, by pure chance, become the baseline for every descendant who ever follows. The future people are not humanity at large, set down somewhere else. They are the genetic shadow of a few hundred specific individuals, cast forward across centuries. The losing happens first. Humanity carries an enormous spread of genetic variation, scattered across billions of people. A few hundred founders can hold only a thin sample of it. Whatever no one aboard happens to carry simply does not make the trip, and once the doors close, there is no way to fetch it. You cannot sample from a source you have left 100 trillion miles behind. The descendants are humanity with the great majority of its variety left standing on the launch pad, waving. Then comes the stranger half, where the rare becomes ordinary. A trait carried by only a handful of people in all of humanity, but present in even one founder, does not stay rare on the ship. It becomes common, and it stays common, written into the baseline of the new world. The exception becomes the rule. This is not a thought experiment. It has already happened, more than once, on Earth. On a small Pacific atoll called Pingalap, a typhoon in the 1770s killed all but around 20 people. One of those survivors carried a rare gene for total colorblindness, the kind that sees the world only in shades of gray. Across the world, that condition appears in maybe one person in 30,000. On Pingalap today, after a couple of centuries of descent from those 20 survivors, it appears in something closer to 1 in 10. A single carrier among a handful of people, amplified by time, reshaped what normal vision means for a whole island. A generation ship is a Pingalap built on purpose. The launch is the catastrophe. The closing doors, the storm that cuts humanity down to a handful. Except this time, the handful is chosen rather than left by chance. Everything that follows from those 20 survivors on the atoll will follow from the founders too. The descendants will be marked, for better and for worse, by the genetic accidents of exactly who walked up the ramp. Whatever a founder happened to carry, a gift, a vulnerability, a quirk of build or mind, has a chance to spread through the whole lineage and become simply how people are out there. And the most consequential cargo is the cargo no one can see. The traits that matter most for this are recessive. They hide. They are carried silently by people who are themselves perfectly healthy, showing nothing, betraying nothing. A founder carrying a devastating recessive disease looks exactly like a founder who carries none. There is no way, even with the most careful screening anyone could manage, to be sure what every boarding body holds folded away in its silent half. So even the most thoughtfully chosen roster boards with invisible passengers, and which hidden genes happen to ride along, is left to chance. The future is sampled, and the sample is full of things no one chose and no one could see. Run that forward far enough and something turns over. The descendants would not experience any of this as a strange inheritance from a few distant ancestors. To them, it would simply be what people are. The narrowed, founder-shaped slice of humanity they were drawn from would be their entire idea of normal. And the full sweep of human variety, all the kinds of people Earth holds, would look to them like the strange and exotic thing. They would be human, unmistakably. They would also be a peculiar, specific, accidental narrowing of human, fixed forever by a list drawn up on a single afternoon. The face you would not quite recognize, the one the first night asked about, may not be a face changed by some dramatic mutation. It may simply be the face of 100 people's descendants after the rest of humanity was sampled away. The roster on that final day is a kind of constitution written in DNA. And the strange vertigo-making thing is that the people writing it cannot read most of what they are setting down. Of every decision front-loaded into the launch, the course, the crew size, the energy spent and locked in, this is the most total and the most invisible. They are choosing the eye color of a great-grandchild they will never meet, and the inherited disease alongside it, and the very texture of what counts as an ordinary person in a world they will never see, and they are doing it half-blind, deciding the deepest things by who simply happened to be standing there. There is no undoing it later. There is no amendment. The gene pool, like the kinetic energy of the ship, is poured in once, at the beginning, and then it is the only one there will ever be. So, before they inherit a mission they never agreed to, the descendants inherit a body shaped by a draw they had no part in. The constraint reaches all the way down, past the choices they will be allowed to make, into the cells they are made of. Their range of possible selves was set before any of them existed, by strangers, from a sample, for reasons that had nothing to do with them. Suppose you managed it flawlessly. Every kind of human diversity preserved, every hidden gene somehow accounted for, the founding pool as rich and balanced as care could make it. It still would not hold. The founders only set the starting point, and the starting point does not stay put. From the very first generation, chance reaches into the pool and quietly takes pieces out, not because anyone breeds badly, not because of any disaster, but because in a small, closed population, variety simply leaks away on its own, a little more each generation, by pure accident. What happens to a gene pool across 400 years then, even when absolutely nothing goes wrong? It thins. Even with flawless breeding, perfect health, no disaster, no mistake of any kind, the gene pool thins, on its own, every generation. The name for it is genetic drift, and it is one of the quietest and most relentless forces in all of biology. Each person passes only a random half of their genes to each child. By pure chance, some variants get handed down a little more often, some a little less, and some not at all. In a vast population, those chances cancel out, and the mix stays steady across the ages. In a small one, they do not cancel, they swing. And every so often, by nothing but luck, a variant swings all the way to zero and is gone, with no one left to carry it, and no way, in a sealed world, for it ever to return. Smallness is not simply fewer genes. It changes the rules the gene pool plays by. On Earth, your particular variants are safe inside a crowd of 8 billion. The randomness of who has children and who does not gets absorbed, drowned out, averaged into stillness. Take that same handful of variants and put them in a population of 200, and the randomness is no longer drowned out. It dominates. Frequencies lurch from one generation to the next, and a variant carried by only a few people can simply vanish in a lifetime or two, for no reason anyone could point to. The ship does not only carry fewer genes than Earth, it carries them in a place where chance has teeth. And here is why this is a fate, and not merely a risk. In a small, closed population, diversity does not wobble around a stable level, it ratchets downward. There is no force on the ship adding variety back. No new people ever arrive with fresh genes. Mutation makes new variants far too slowly to keep up. So every generation removes a little and returns nothing, and the only direction the pool can move, over centuries, is toward less. Careful management can slow the bleed. Nothing aboard can stop it. As the diversity drains, the people left grow steadily more related to one another, and that is when the hidden cargo from before begins to surface. The silent recessive diseases the founders carried, the ones that showed nothing because each person had only one copy, start finding their matches as cousins, generations down, unknowingly carry the same buried gene. What was invisible becomes expressed. Fertility softens. More pregnancies end early. More children are born with conditions that were always latent in the pool, and only now have the relatedness to appear. This is inbreeding depression, and it arrives not as a blow but as a slow bending of the curves. Earth has watched this happen, and watched the one thing that reverses it. The Florida panther, by the 1990s, had dwindled to a few dozen animals, sealed off in the southern swamps, and the inbreeding showed in their bodies: kinked tails, holes in the heart, failing fertility, sperm that no longer worked. They were sliding toward genetic death, and they were saved by exactly one move. A handful of cougars were brought in from Texas, carrying fresh genes from outside, and the new variation broke the spiral. The population recovered. That rescue is the single reliable cure for a closed pool drifting toward collapse, proven again and again in the wild. New blood from elsewhere. And it is the one move a generation ship can never, ever make. There is no Texas out there. There is no elsewhere. The only cure that has ever worked is the cure a sealed ship surrendered the moment its doors shut. There is no villain anywhere in this story, and that is the part I find hard to forgive. Drift commits the perfect crime. It has no culprit, because no one bred badly, and no one made a wrong call. It has no moment, because it happens continuously, in every birth, forever. And it has no symptom for a long time, because the founders are fine, and their children are fine, and their grandchildren are fine. Then, generations on, it surfaces, and even then not as an event you could point at. It surfaces as a statistic, a fertility rate that has bent a little lower than it was, a count of certain illnesses that has crept a little higher. Patterns visible only in the aggregate, only to whoever keeps the records carefully enough to notice, and only long after every person who might have done something about it has been gone for 100 years. It is a harm that no living person caused, and no living person can yet see. That is the strangest weight in the whole population problem. With the energy, with the course, with the crew size, you could at least imagine someone choosing wrongly. Here there may be no wrong choice at all. A group can be selected with every possible care, launched in perfect genetic health, managed impeccably the whole way, and still slide. Because being few in a closed world is not a mistake you can avoid. It is a condition you cannot escape. The fate is built into the smallness itself. And drift is one of the quiet engines behind the question from the first night. Not a single dramatic mutation that remakes a person overnight, but an endless, faceless reshaping of the pool, generation after generation, carrying the descendants somewhere neither they nor anyone chose, by a process with no hand on the wheel. Drift takes the old variety away. That is only half the damage. While the inherited diversity leaks out, new errors are being written in. Mutations, including the ones written by the radiation pouring through the hull every second, keep arriving in the genes. In a large population, the mildly harmful ones get quietly weeded out, because even a small disadvantage, multiplied across millions, loses the long game. In a small population, that weeding barely works. The harmful little mutations slip past, accumulate, and some, by the same blind drift, become fixed, written permanently into everyone. The pool loses its good variants and keeps its bad ones at the same time, from both ends at once, and there is no specialist to catch any of it, no laboratory to call, no expert beyond the wall to ask what is going wrong. What happens to the health of a people when the mistakes keep arriving, the cures keep leaving, and there is no one left in the universe to phone for help? The people get sicker, slowly, generation by generation, at the same time as they grow less able to do anything about it. Take the sickness first. Every child born anywhere carries dozens of brand new genetic mutations, mistakes in the copying that neither parent had, somewhere between 50 and 100 fresh changes in each new person. Most do nothing. A few are mildly harmful. In a large population, those mildly harmful ones get slowly weeded out across the generations. In a small one, the weeding barely works, and the radiation pouring through the hull writes still more of them in. So the burden of inherited illness does not hold steady on this ship. It rises. The pool keeps the bad and loses the good, and the bill is paid in human bodies. Now the other side, the falling one, and it begins with seeing what medicine actually is. We picture a doctor as a person. A cure is not a person. A cure is a civilization. Behind the one figure in the white coat stand millions of specialists, each trained for a decade in a single corner of the body. And behind them, a research enterprise centuries deep, and behind that, the factories that synthesize the drugs, the supply chains that carry the reagents, the whole planet-sized machine that has to be running for the person in the room to be able to help you. Seal a few thousand people away from all of it, and you have not lost a doctor. You have lost everything that stood behind the doctor. You keep the white coat and throw away the world that made it mean anything. A few thousand people can train good generalists. They cannot hold deep expertise in every rare disease at once. They cannot run a pharmaceutical industry. They cannot replace the constant outside stream of new treatments that, on Earth, we simply assume will keep arriving. And the knowledge they do carry decays the same way the reactors does. A surgery performed once in a generation is half forgotten by the next. The understanding behind a treatment thins into a procedure followed by rote, until someone faces a case the procedure was never written for, and there is no one alive who knows the reasoning underneath it. But Earth is still there, you might say, still able to help. Why not simply ask? Run the timing, and the answer is cruel. Early in the voyage, A message to Earth and its reply take years to cross the gap. Deep in the dark, tens of light years out, that becomes decades each way. A request for help with a dying patient reaches Earth long after the patient is dead, and the answer comes home long after the doctor who sent the question is dead too. You ask the living for help, and by the time anyone could respond, you are speaking to people who have replaced the ones you wrote to, about a patient who is now a name on a list, a message to the dead, answered to the unborn. We think of being alone as having no one within reach. There is a colder version of it. The crew are not alone because space is empty around them. They are alone because everyone who could help them is years in their past and years in their future at once, separated not by distance they could cross, but by time that only runs one way. Earth's whole medical civilization is still out there, still working, and completely useless to them, like a lit window on the far side of a canyon too wide for any voice to carry. And the illnesses may be ones Earth has never seen. The bacteria and viruses aboard evolve in their own sealed world, drifting away from anything in Earth's medical books, while the crew's immune defenses narrow by the same drift that thins everything else. The genes that let a population fight a wide range of infections depend on variety, on no two people defending the body in quite the same way. As that variety leaks out, the whole crew slowly comes to share the same blind spots. A genetically narrowed population is uniquely defenseless against a single new infection that happens to find the gap they all share, and isolated human groups on Earth have been emptied exactly that way, by one disease sweeping through people who all caught it the same. Here, when it happens, there is no outside to send survivors, or medicine, or anything at all. Here is the shape that unsettles me most, drawn as two lines. On Earth, the burden of disease and the power to treat it rise together. We learn more, so we can do more, and the two climb side by side through history. On this ship, they come apart. The need climbs, driven by mutation and drift and radiation, while the ability sinks, drained by smallness and decay and the silence of the years. The two lines, which have moved together for the whole of human history, pull in opposite directions in the dark, and somewhere out there, with no one watching, they cross. The sickest these people will ever be is precisely the moment they are least able to heal themselves, and nothing, by then, can be done. When the curves cross, one lever still remains, and it is the most intimate one there is. You cannot pull the accumulated damage back out of a living person. There is no medicine for a body that was born carrying the load. The only place left to intervene is before birth, not after. Not in curing the sick, but in shaping who is born sick at all. When health can no longer be restored, the last health policy left is a policy over who exists, and the clinic quietly moves upstream, out of the hospital and into the act of conception itself. The ship's deepest and final medical system turns out not to be its doctors. It is its control over reproduction. So the failing body drives the most private human act out of private hands. Having a child stops being something two people decide alone and becomes the ship's medicine of last resort, the one remaining tool against a tide that nothing else can hold back. What happens to the most intimate thing a person does when it is no longer theirs to do, but the survival system of a whole world? It becomes managed, the way the reactor and the water and the air are managed. And in becoming managed, it carries the ship straight into the one thing modern ethics has worked hardest to forbid: control over who has children with whom and who is born at all. Not out of cruelty, not out of any belief in better blood, out of arithmetic. The genetics we have just traced leave no other door. A small, closed pool that is bleeding diversity and gaining harmful mutations cannot be left to chance, and the only place to act is the place we hold most private. The tools already exist, most of them in use today. To hold variety in a small population, you direct who pairs with whom, matching people to keep the relatedness low and the diversity high, generation after generation. This is exactly how we save endangered animals now. Zoos keep what they call a stud book, a careful record of the ancestry of every individual, and plan each pairing to wring the most genetic variety out of the fewest creatures. A generation ship would keep a stud book of its people and plan their families the same way, because in the only sense that matters to the gene pool, the crew is an endangered species, and the stud book is the ship's defense against extinction. Then there is the reserve, and it changes the shape of everything. Alongside the living crew, the ship carries frozen embryos and cells from many thousands of diverse donors back on Earth, far more genetic variety than the few thousand living bodies could ever hold between them. Carefully, across the centuries, those can be thawed and brought to birth, threading fresh variation back into a pool that is otherwise only losing it. It is a partial answer to the problem with no answer. The gene flow from outside that the ship could never have. The cougars from Texas, carried frozen in a tank. The elsewhere these people lack, packed into cold storage and rationed out across 400 years. Sit with what that reserve actually is, because it reorders the whole ship. Measured in genetic future, the frozen cells are worth more than every living person aboard, because they hold the diversity the living are steadily losing. The single most precious thing on the vessel may be a tank of cells kept a few degrees above the cold of space, a vault of possible people, never born, most of whom never will be, held in reserve against the slow drift of everyone who is. The living crew do not simply use that reserve, they guard it. Part of their purpose is to keep the unborn future safe and to release it with care, which means the most important people on the ship may be the ones who do not yet exist. A gene pool is a diagram until you remember that someone has to carry each pregnancy. Fertility, in the specific bodies that hold it, becomes a ship system like any other, watched and depended on, and when the numbers demand it, directed. How many children, when, by whom, from which stored embryos? The most personal thing a body can do becomes scheduled and allocated, a function of the vessel's survival rather than a private decision of the person living inside that body. The womb joins the reactor and the water loop on the list of things the ship cannot allow to run on their own. This is the heaviest turn in the whole story, and it deserves to be looked at from both sides without flinching. On Earth, we hold reproductive freedom close to sacred, and we did not arrive at that lightly. We arrived at it after centuries that included forced sterilizations and doctrines about superior bloodlines and the machinery of states deciding which people deserve to have children. The ship rebuilds that control, not as a doctrine, not driven by hatred or by any theory of worth, but as a requirement for staying alive. One case says this is monstrous wherever it comes from, that the moment you treat people as a gene pool to be optimized, you have reduced them to breeding stock and broken something at the root of human dignity. The other case says that refusing it does not protect anyone. It only chooses the slow genetic death we already watched arrive, and hands a doomed and dwindling pool to children who would have given anything to be born whole. Both are true at once, and the ship does not let you keep them apart. I cannot file this one cleanly under cruelty, and I cannot file it under care either. What unsettles me most is that there is no one to resist. On Earth, control over reproduction always came from somewhere, a regime, a church, a man with power, and where there is a someone, there is a tyranny you can name and fight and overthrow. Here there is no someone. The unfreedom is not imposed by anyone. It is simply the shape of being few in a sealed world, chosen by no person, enforced by no person, and total all the same. You can overthrow a tyrant. You cannot overthrow a gene pool. The most private freedom a human being has is taken away not by force but by mathematics, which is the one oppressor that cannot be argued with and will never let go. And the founders, at least, could agree to it. They could weigh the whole grim arithmetic with open eyes and accept the stud book in the bank as the price of going, a price they chose to pay. The children born into it agreed to nothing. They opened their eyes already inside the system. In a world where who they may love and whether they may have children was settled before they existed, by people they will never meet, for reasons that began long before them. The most intimate freedom a person can hold was spent on their behalf, generations early, and they inherit only its absence. Look closely at who all this careful tending is for. The pairings, the frozen vault, the diversity measured out drop by precious drop, the bodies managed like systems, every piece of it exists to deliver a healthy, whole population to a world at the end of the voyage. But the people whose genes the system manages most jealously, the ones deep in the middle of the crossing, are the very people who will never see that world. Their bodies are being optimized, their most private lives rearranged, their freedom quietly spent for an arrival they are structurally shut out of. So who, in the end, is all of this for? All of it is for an arrival that the managed people will never reach. And that answer points straight at the thing this whole story has been circling from the first night without once naming it. The people in the middle. Not the founders who chose the voyage, not the descendants who finally step out onto new ground. The vast, nameless population in between, born in the dark and gone in the dark, who are the real subject of everything we have said and the ones no one ever quite talks about. Start with how many of them there are, because the number alone reorders the story. A 400-year crossing runs to roughly 16 generations, parent to child, 16 times over. The ship cannot grow without limit, so its population holds roughly steady, which means that across those 16 generations, the same few thousand bunks are filled and emptied and filled again, 16 times. Add up every human being who ever lives aboard across the whole voyage, and the founders are a thin sliver at the start, and the arrivals a thin sliver at the end, and everyone else, something like 7 of every 8 people who ever draw breath on that ship, tens of thousands of lives, belongs to the middle. The crossing is not mostly about the people who leave or the people who arrive. By sheer count of lives, the crossing is almost entirely about the people who do neither. We have been asking the wrong question the entire time. We ask whether the ship will make it. That is a question about the ends, about the founders and the arrivals, about whether the bridge connects. But the ship, in head count and in every working system, is almost entirely its middle. The middle is not a stage of the journey that you pass through on the way to the point. The middle is the journey. The ends are only where it starts and where it stops. So to ask whether the whole thing is worth it is mostly to ask whether it is worth it for them, and they are the one group never consulted, not in the planning and not in the living. Everything we have traced lands on their shoulders. They absorb the heaviest radiation, conceived and aged in the deepest dark. They carry the full weight of the stud book and the managed womb. They hold the gene pool through its most fragile stretch, when the drift bites hardest and the load climbs fastest. They nurse the ship through its long middle age, when the failures multiply. They keep the reactor's understanding alive across the longest reach of the relay. Every system on the vessel rests on the generations in the middle. They carry the most of everything, and they are owed the least. There is an image that holds this exactly. A long bridge has its heaviest load not at the ends but in the center span, the stretch that hangs farthest out over the gap. The two ends rest on solid ground. One end stands on the memory of Earth, the founders who knew a real sky. The far end stands on the new world, the arrivals who finally reach it. The center span touches neither. It is anchored to nothing but the spans on either side of it, holding the greatest weight of the whole crossing while reaching no shore at all. That is the middle generations, fastened only to the generation before and the generation after, bearing the full load of the passage and resting, themselves, on no solid ground anywhere. Here is the thing the title has been promising, and it is not what most people expect. There is an old idea, held across many traditions and hard-won, that you must never use a person merely as a means to someone else's end. That every person is an end in themselves, never only a tool for someone else's arrival. A generation ship, by its very design, treats most of the people it will ever carry as means. A bridge built to be walked across. Not because anyone aboard is cruel. The crew might be gentle, the society kind, the daily life warm and full of love. It does not matter. The using is in the architecture, not in the conduct, and no amount of kindness in the living can remove what is built into the structure. The terror the first night promised was never mainly that the ship might fail. It is that the ship could succeed completely, deliver its people safely to a beautiful new world, and still have spent the lives of 70,000 human beings as the means to that end, with their full consent never once obtained, because most of them were born already inside the using. And yet I do not think it is quite that simple, and honesty demands the other side. Is this really so different from any human life? Every generation that has ever lived inherited a world it did not make and handed it forward to a future it would not see. Parents pour themselves into children who can never repay them. Every link in the long chain of any civilization labors for a tomorrow it will not live in. One view says the ship is uniquely monstrous, that it manufactures lives whose entire purpose is instrumental, and that this is a crime no destination could justify. The other says the ship invents nothing. It only concentrates, makes total and literal and impossible to look away from, the instrumental thread that runs quietly through every life that has ever been lived. By that reading, the middle generations are no more used than you or I. They are only used more honestly, with the truth of it laid bare instead of hidden. Both of those are true, and the ship will not let you keep them apart. I keep failing to decide whether the middle generations are tragic or simply human, and I have come to think the failure is the honest answer. There can be a real and hard-won dignity in a life that holds the weight, knowing it will never reach the far shore, that gives itself to a crossing it will not complete, and finds meaning in the giving. And there can be a real injustice in being born to do exactly that without ever once being asked. Both of those can live inside the same single life, the same person, on the same ordinary day, and nothing about the ship resolves them. It only makes them impossible to ignore. Their bodies hold the mission. That much is settled. But a body is not the only thing the middle generations have to carry across the long center of the voyage. They must also carry the knowledge, how to run the reactor, heal the sick, mend the failing hull, keep the air honest, handed mind to mind down all those generations with no outside library to fall back on. And knowledge, we have already seen, is the most perishable cargo of all. So can the understanding survive the same long middle the bodies must, or does something quieter than any death wait for a people that slowly forgets how its own world works? Something quieter than death does wait, and it has a precise shape. The ship can carry every fact humanity has ever written down, The entire library, perfectly preserved, every manual and every paper intact, and still forget how to use any of it. Because understanding was never stored in the library. It is stored in people, and people are exactly the thing the ship keeps replacing. The books are permanent. The readers are not. And a library no one can fully read is not knowledge. It is furniture. The gap between having the information and being able to use it is wider than it looks. A database holds facts and procedures. It cannot hold the skill of putting them to work. There is a simple truth about expertise that we mostly ignore. We know more than we can say. You can ride a bicycle, but you cannot write down instructions complete enough for someone to ride one from your words alone. You can recognize a friend's face in a crowd, instantly, and you could never describe how. A master machinist feels when a cut is right. An experienced doctor reads a patient before any test comes back. None of that lives on a page. It lives in trained hands and trained minds, grown slowly through practice and through watching someone who already knows, and it passes from person to person, or it does not pass at all. 3 things make the deepest knowledge impossible to fully write down. The first is that much of it is unconscious. The expert cannot explain the rules they follow because the rules went automatic years ago, below the reach of words. The second is the cruelest. Experts leave out what is obvious to them, and what is obvious to an expert is precisely the foundation everything else stands on. The 1,000 small things too basic to bother recording are the first to vanish, and they were never written down because no one thought something so plain could ever be forgotten. The third is judgment. A manual covers the cases someone anticipated. Real understanding handles the case no one saw coming, and a person who only follows procedure fails the exact moment reality steps off the script. We have already watched this happen on Earth, inside living memory. We have the blueprints for the Saturn rocket that carried human beings to the moon, every page of them, and we can no longer build it. Not because the documents were lost, because the thousands of skilled hands that built it retired and scattered. The undocumented tricks went with them. The suppliers closed. The living tradition dissolved. The knowing was never only in the blueprints, and once the people were gone, the blueprints alone could not bring the machine back. A whole spacefaring civilization, with universities and a planet-wide network and every advantage, lost the ability to build its greatest machine in about 50 years. Now ask what happens to a few thousand sealed people, with none of those advantages, across 400. Here is the reframe that makes the danger clear. Knowledge is alive, and it dies the way a living thing dies. It has to be reproduced every single generation, grown fresh in new minds through teaching and apprenticeship, and that reproduction loses a little each time, the way a copy of a copy blurs. It drifts, exactly as the genes drift, and it can go extinct, exactly as a species goes extinct when too few carriers remain to pass it on. The ship carries a population of skills alongside its population of people and its population of crops and microbes, and that population of skills is subject to the same forces we have already met, the same drift, the same one-way erosion, the same bottleneck. Understanding, on this ship, is a living thing, and living things can starve and narrow and die. A tradition needs a crowd to stay alive. You need enough working experts to train enough apprentices to keep the craft breathing into the next generation, and the one after that. Drop below some threshold of living masters and the tradition simply collapses, the chain broken with no way to relink it from outside. A small population is at structural risk of forgetting how its own world works for the same reason it is at risk of genetic ruin. There are only so many minds, and the hardest knowledge needs more minds than a small world can spare to hold it safe. Try this on your own, knowing for a moment. How much of what you can do could you actually explain, well enough for a stranger to do it from your words alone, with no chance to watch you and no chance to practice? For most of what we are good at, the honest answer is almost none of it. Now picture a people who maintain their entire world this way, keeping the reactor running and the air honest, and the crops growing by motions handed down so many times that the reasons have worn away. Competent and clueless at once, doing all the right things for reasons no one alive remembers. It works. It works for a long time. It works right up until the day reality steps off the script, and there is no one left who can reason past the ritual to meet it. This is the second weight the middle generations carry, after their bodies. They must keep the understanding alive across the longest and most fragile stretch of the whole voyage. The generations farthest from the founders who knew why, and farthest from the arrivals who might one day relearn it on solid ground. The knowledge runs thinnest, exactly where the journey runs longest. And a people who keep their world running by rote, who can no longer explain the very machine that keeps them breathing, are recognizably human and quietly estranged from everything their ancestors actually understood. It is one more way the people at the far end are no longer the people who left. Skills are not the only thing that drifts when it is passed mind to mind for 16 generations. The words drift too. The meanings shift under the people using them, and the story of why any of this is happening at all, told and retold by generations who have never seen the place they left or the place they are going, bends and thins like everything else aboard. What becomes of the reason for the journey, and of the language built to carry it? After 16 lifetimes of people repeating a story, none of them ever lived. A people can forget why they are traveling, but not in the way the old stories tell it. The dramatic version, a crew that no longer knows it is on a ship at all, that thinks the curved walls are the whole of the world, is too crude to be the real danger. There are windows, there are records. The destination is written down. The true forgetting is quieter and far more certain, and what it takes is not the facts, it is the meaning. The reason for the journey survives perfectly well as information, and dies slowly as motivation. A people can know exactly why they are crossing the dark, and have that knowledge weigh almost nothing at all. Start with the words themselves, because language is never still. Every language drifts, generation by generation, in sound and in meaning, and within a few centuries it moves past recognition. The English of 1,000 years ago is a foreign tongue to us now. Even 6 centuries back, the words are a struggle. And meanings slide out from under the people using them while no one is watching. The word nice once meant ignorant. Awful once meant full of awe, a term of praise. Silly once meant blessed and innocent. None of those speakers felt the ground move. Each generation simply used the words as it had received them, slightly bent, and passed them on a little more bent still. In a small, sealed speech community, the drift runs faster and stranger, by the same mathematics that makes the genes drift in a small pool. The ship is an island, and islands grow their own tongues. The cruelty is which words drift most dangerously. The founders defined the mission in particular words: home, earth, arrival, we. To a founder, home meant a blue planet under an open sky, the place they came from and grieved. To a child born aboard, home means the ship, the only home there has ever been. So when a descendant reads the founding charter, the one that says, "We travel to find a new home," the central word has already turned against the sentence. It points backward, to the place being left, not forward, to the place being sought. The mission's own founding language slowly comes apart in the mouths of the very people meant to carry it out, not because they are careless, but because the words kept living after the founders died, and living things change. The reason for the voyage has the same flaw as the knowledge that runs the reactor. You can store the sentence. You cannot store the weight. A database can hold the words we left to find a new home for our children. It cannot hold the desperation, or the wonder, or the chosenness that made grown people willing to give their entire lives and their children's lives to those words. The next generation inherits the sentence stripped of the feeling that made it worth dying for. And a purpose with the weight gone out of it is no longer a purpose. It is only a story. And a story can be doubted, reinterpreted, or quietly set down. There is a clean way to see the difference. The founders are converts. They chose the mission with the full force of a decision freely made, the way a person who walks into a faith as an adult holds it with the heat of having chosen. The middle generations are born into it, the way a person is born into a religion rather than choosing one. And the gap between a convert's belief and an inherited belief is exactly the gap between a purpose chosen and a purpose received. The mission becomes a kind of state faith of the ship, taught to the young, maintained by the institutions, perhaps even sincerely held, but it is inherited now, and inheritance always arrives lighter than choice. To a child who has never seen a star up close, the destination is not a hope, it is a rumor. A place described in old recordings, believed in thinly, never once felt, as abstract as a promised paradise, and asking the same kind of faith. How do you long for a shore you cannot picture? How do you spend your one life, and accept that your children will spend theirs, for a place that is, to you, a word in an old document and a point of light, no different from 10,000 others outside the glass? The mission asks the people in the middle to give everything for a destination that is, in their actual experience, a rumor handed down by the dead. A people born and raised inside the ship may come, across 16 generations, to want different things than the founders wanted. They may grow to love the life they have. They may doubt the whole enterprise. They may decide the point was never the destination at all. The priorities of the arrivals need not match the priorities of the founders, because the culture carrying those priorities has been drifting the entire way, like the language and the genes and the skills. The why is not a fixed star the ship steers by. It is a living thing aboard the ship, and it can drift anywhere, including all the way to refusal. A people who stop believing in the journey could end it. They could refuse to have the children the mission depends on. They could turn the ship. They could simply stop tending it and let it fail. The crossing cannot afford to leave belief to natural drift, because natural drift does not reliably point at the destination. To reach the far shore, the mission needs the middle generations to keep wanting to continue, to keep accepting their role, to keep believing across 4 centuries, with no founder left to remind them why. Which means the voyage cannot only manage the gene pool and the air and the water, it has to manage minds. It has to make sure the people in the middle go on consenting, generation after generation, to a thing they never chose, for a place they cannot picture. So ask the question plainly, because the answer is the most disturbing thing in this entire story. What, exactly, does a mission have to do to a people to guarantee that 400 years in, they still want to keep going? The answer is the opposite of what the word manage suggests. To guarantee that the people in the middle keep going, the mission does not need to control them, or suppress them, or keep them in line. It needs to make them happy. Think about why misery fails. A population that suffers, that aches for an open sky it can never reach, that feels every day the weight of the bars, is not a stable population. It rebels, it despairs, it refuses to have the children the mission depends on. It lets the ship slide, out of grief or out of spite. Suffering is not the mission's tool. Suffering is the mission's enemy. the single most likely thing to end the voyage before it arrives. What the crossing needs, above all, is for the people in the middle to be content, to find the life aboard sufficient, to not long for what cannot be given. And contentment, we have already seen, cannot be left to drift. Belief wanders across the generations, desire wanders with it. So to guarantee a content population across 16 generations, contentment cannot be hoped for. It has to be ensured. You have to raise people who, from their first breath, do not want the things the ship cannot provide. People who never ache for an open horizon because they were never given the longing for one. People who experience the curved floors, the recycled air, the assigned work, the managed families, not as a cage but as the shape of a normal life, as the way the world simply is and ought to be. Here is the turn the whole story has been moving toward, and it does not arrive as villainy. This is achievable, and it is achieved through what looks, from every angle, like kindness. You do not break these people into obedience. You shape their wants, gently, from childhood, until the cage fits so perfectly that it stops being felt as a cage at all. You raise them to desire exactly what the ship can give, and nothing it cannot. The most successful version of this mission is not the one that imprisons people who burn to be free. It is the one that produces people who are sincerely, deeply happy, who hold no concept of the freedom they are missing, who would not walk out the door if you opened it, because they were built from the inside to fit the room. And the deprivation becomes invisible to the deprived. A person raised never to want an open sky feels no absence when there is none. From inside that life, it is not deprivation. It is simply life, and often a good one, full of love and work and meaning. The cruelty is precisely that there is no felt cruelty anywhere in it. What has been removed is not their freedom, it is their desire for freedom. And a person who does not desire a thing cannot miss it, cannot mourn it, cannot even know that it was taken from them before they were old enough to ask. There are two ways to keep a bird in a cage. You can clip a wild bird's wings and watch it throw itself against the bars, again and again, mad with the memory of flight. Or you can raise a bird that has never known anything but the cage, that does not see the bars as bars, that has no idea the sky exists, and sits perfectly happy on its perch its whole life long. The second bird suffers less. By every measure of happiness you could take, the second bird is better off, and the second bird is also, more completely than the first, caged, because the cage is no longer around it. The cage has been moved inside it. The most humane thing the ship can do to a child is to move the cage inside. This reaches deeper than taking the sky away. Deprivation leaves the self intact. The clipped bird still knows what flight was, still wants it, and the part of it that wants survives, even behind the bars. This goes past that. It edits the person so that the wanting self never forms in the first place. The ship did not take away their sky, it took away the part of them that would ever have wanted a sky. The shaping goes all the way down, beneath choices and beliefs, into the desires themselves, and a happy person shaped that thoroughly has lost the one thing that would let them know they were unfree. They have lost even the ability to object. And none of it requires a crude machine of brainwashing. It needs only the ordinary tools every culture on Earth already uses on its children. What the young are taught to value. The stories held up as true, the kind of life presented as a good one, and the kinds of longing simply never planted, never named, never offered. Every society shapes the desires of its children. The ship has only to do it on purpose, and do it well, with one outcome that can never be allowed to fail. Produce people who want to stay. The people in the middle must live and die aboard this ship no matter what anyone does. The physics settled that centuries before they were born, and it cannot be undone. So what is the kind thing? To raise them longing for a sky they can never reach, awake to everything they will never have, and let them grieve it for an entire lifetime? Or to raise them whole and content and happy with the only life that was ever going to be available to them? If you cannot give them the sky, is it crueler to leave them wanting it, or to spare them the want? The engineered contentment is, from one angle, the deepest violation that can be done to a person, the remaking of a soul to fit a box, and from another angle, it is the only mercy the situation permits. And they are the same act, the same shaping, of the same child, on the same ordinary afternoon. You cannot give them a good life without remaking them to fit a small one. You cannot spare them the longing without quietly removing the self that would have longed. The kindness and the cruelty are not two things that must be weighed against each other. They are one thing, wearing one face, and you cannot take either without taking both. The image I cannot get out of my head is the bird that would thank you for the cage. Because this is what the first night was really pointing at, underneath all the radiation and the drifting genes and the failing reactors. The terror of the generation ship was never that it fails. It was never even that the people suffer. The terror is that it succeeds by remaking human beings until they fit it, and that the better the voyage goes, the more total that remaking has to be. A perfectly successful generation ship is, by its own definition, the one that has most thoroughly engineered the desires of its people. Generations of genuinely happy human beings, happy because they were built to be, who never knew the freedom they did not have, and who would thank you, sincerely, with real gratitude in their eyes, for the cage they cannot see. Success and the deepest unfreedom imaginable turn out to be the same outcome, reached by the same road, and there is no version of arriving that does not pass through it. And if their wants were shaped before they were old enough to want anything, if they were raised, from the cradle, to agree, then a question has been standing quietly behind all of this from the beginning. Can a person who was made to consent be said to have consented at all? Did anyone in the middle of this voyage, across all those 16 generations, ever truly agree to a single part of it? No one in the middle ever signed it. And the first thing everyone says, hearing that, is that it does not matter, because none of us signed the terms of our own lives either. You did not consent to your country, your language, your laws, the era you were born into, the debts and the damage handed to you by people centuries dead. You were simply born into all of it, and you have managed. So have the people on the ship. That is the ordinary answer. And it is a good one. I want to take it seriously, and then watch what happens to it, piece by piece, on this particular ship, because every part of it breaks. The ordinary answer rests on a set of quiet escape hatches, things that make being born into an unchosen life bearable, even when we never name them. The ship closes them one at a time. The first is exit. On Earth, in principle, you can leave. You can emigrate, change your circumstances, walk away from the society that bound you, and find another. The possibility of going is what makes staying tolerable. You remain, at some level, because you could leave and chose not to. On the ship there is no leaving. There is nowhere else in the universe to go, and the nearest anything is centuries away through vacuum. The one thing that makes being born into a place acceptable, the open door at your back, does not exist. The second is reform. On Earth, you can change the society you inherited. Vote, argue, rebel, rewrite the terms, bend the old contract toward your own will across a lifetime. On the ship, the central term cannot be touched. The destination, the crossing, the 400 years of it were fixed by physics before anyone aboard was born. The energy was spent centuries ago and cannot be called back. You can rearrange the society inside the hull as much as you like. You cannot change where it is going, or the fact that you will spend your whole life going there. The one term that defines your entire existence is the one term no vote can reach. The third is tacit consent. Philosophers have long argued that by staying in a society and accepting its benefits, you quietly agree to it, even without signing anything. But that kind of agreement means nothing without a real alternative. Consent that had no option to refuse is not consent. It is just what happened to you. With no exit and no reform, there is no alternative for the people in the middle to tacitly agree to or against. The argument that rescues every ordinary society needs a door somewhere in the room, and this room has none. And the fourth hatch is the one the last act already closed. On Earth, even bound, even unable to leave, you keep the power to object, to wish it were otherwise, to withhold the assent inside your own head, whatever your body has to do. The ship takes even that. The people in the middle were shaped, from childhood, not to wish they could refuse. The contract is enforced not by chains, not by walls, but by the engineered absence of any desire to break it. They do not strain against the terms, because they were built not to want to. The last lock is not on the door, it is on the wish to open it. Strip all four hatches away, and you are left with the bare shape of the thing, with nothing to soften it. A person bound, completely, by a choice made before they existed. No exit, no reform, no real alternative to weigh, and no wish to refuse, because the wish itself was quietly removed before it could form. Every comfort we use to make an unchosen life acceptable has been taken, one by one, until only the pure structure remains. And then, just when the objection seems airtight, it turns over in your hands. These exact people would not exist without the mission. They are the products of the managed pairings, the chosen timing, the whole apparatus we have spent so long describing. Had the founders decided differently, different people would have been born, or no one at all. So you cannot quite say the mission wronged these particular individuals compared with a life where they exist and are free, because in that life they do not exist. They are not prisoners taken from a freedom they once had. They are children of the very thing that binds them. The grievance and the gift are the same act. You cannot wish them released from the mission without wishing them never born. We do not let a parent do anything at all to a child on the grounds that the child would not exist otherwise. Existence is not a blank check that excuses whatever follows. The strange logic of it only sharpens the question instead of answering it. It reveals that consent and harm, the tools we normally reach for, may not even fit cleanly onto people whose very being depends on the thing they might object to. One honest reading says this is the most total denial of human autonomy that can be imagined, a life with no say whatsoever in its own terms. Another honest reading says the objection may be confused at the root, asking for consent from beings who could not exist to give it. I do not think this question has a clean answer, and I have stopped trusting anyone who tells me it does. Both readings are standing in the room, and the ship will not let either one leave. What the founders did, in the end, was put a signature on a contract whose other parties did not yet exist and would never be handed a pen. And it binds them not through law, which a later generation could repeal, but through three locks no later generation can reach: physics, which cannot unlaunch the ship; biology, which made them out of the mission itself; and the shaping of the mind, which raised them to accept it as the air they breathe. A contract enforced by the universe, by their own bodies, and by their own contentment, all at once. And the part that should follow us out of this act is that we are all in smaller measure, parties to contracts we never signed. Our nation, our century, our bodies, the deaths and the wreckage handed down to us by the dead. The ship is only the pure case, the universal condition stripped of every softening hatch and held up to the light. To judge what was done to the people in the middle is, very quietly, to judge something about every life that has ever been lived, including the one you are living tonight. But a society of the unconsenting, bound and unable to leave, still has to be run. Someone has to settle the disputes, divide the scarce things, keep the peace, hold the order, day after day, in a world no person can ever walk out of. And ruling people who never agreed to be ruled, and can never, ever leave, is its own hard problem. How do you govern a world with no door? The deepest fact about freedom is one we never notice, because we have always had it. The door. Not using the door, having it. Almost everything we call freedom rests, quietly, on the ability to leave a job, a town, a bad marriage, a conversation, a country. The right to speak, the right to refuse, the check on every power that holds authority over us, all of it sits on top of a foundation we rarely look at. In the end, freedom was always, secretly, the freedom to go. The generation ship is the first human society ever built with the door welded shut from the first day. And sealing the door does not only trap the people inside, it pulls the foundation out from under the whole structure of their freedom, because the thing freedom was built on was the open door, and now there is none. See what that does to power. When people can leave, the threat of leaving disciplines whoever rules them. A leader who abuses people too badly loses them, watches them slip across the border to somewhere kinder, and so even a tyrant is checked, a little, by the simple existence of elsewhere. Remove the exit, and you remove the check. The ship hands its rulers the most captive subjects in all of human history. People who cannot leave, cannot flee, cannot defect, cannot vanish into the next valley or the next country, who have nowhere in the entire universe to run for their whole lives, across every generation. No government on Earth has ever held subjects this captive, because Earth always had a somewhere else, a border, a frontier, an open sea, a horizon to walk toward. The ship abolishes somewhere else, and with it abolishes the oldest restraint on power there is. The same sealed door does something to the ordinary friction of living together. On Earth, conflict dissipates through distance. We move apart. We avoid the people we cannot stand. We leave the town, start over among strangers. Let the years and the miles cool what went wrong. On the ship there is no apart to move to. Every person you have ever wronged, and every person who has ever wronged you, is still there tomorrow, and the day after, and for the rest of your life. Grudges cannot be outrun. Feuds compound and pass to children who inherit a quarrel they never started. The friction that Earth quietly bleeds off through separation has nowhere on the ship to go. It can only build or be pressed down. We have seen smaller versions in the confined crews of submarines and polar stations, where the inability to get away from one another corrodes people who genuinely like each other. The ship is that, for centuries, with no end. And the society is caught in a vice with the same shape as every other on this ship. A world running on fragile life support cannot tolerate real disorder. A violent faction, an act of sabotage, a breakdown in the daily cooperation that keeps the air breathable and the reactor fed. Any of these could kill everyone aboard, because the systems demand constant, competent, willing hands. So the society cannot afford freedom that risks the machinery. But it also cannot release its pressure through exit, because there is no exit. Squeezed between too little order, where the air fails, and too much order, where you have a captive and total regime, the room left for an open, free society may be almost none. This is where the most dangerous argument in all of politics becomes, for once, true. On Earth, a ruler who says freedom threatens our survival, so you must submit, is almost always lying, using a false emergency to justify control he simply wants. On the ship, it is not a lie. The fragility is real. Disorder genuinely could kill everyone. So the actual survival of the world becomes a real and constant justification for control, and there is no clean line anywhere between the control the ship truly needs to keep breathing and the control a regime would happily seize for its own sake. The emergency that tyrants have always had to invent is, here, simply the weather. So where does authority find its right to rule, with both consent and exit gone? The most stable answer is the one we already met, and it should send a chill back through everything before it. You raise people who accept it. Legitimacy not from consent, which they cannot give, nor from the freedom to leave, which they do not have, but from upbringing. A government secure not because the governed chose it, but because they were shaped, from childhood, to find it as natural as the curved floor under their feet. Authority and the engineered contentment turn out to be the same machine. Whatever makes a child content with the ship makes that child content with the ship's rulers. The political order and the shaped soul are not two systems. They are one, and it runs in both directions at once. Picture the room. A room whose only door was sealed generations ago, by people long dead, so completely that the ones living in it now have never seen the door, do not know it was ever there, and have built their entire world on the unspoken certainty that walls are simply the nature of things. When I try to imagine actually living there, it is not the politics that reaches me first. It is the smallest thing. You could never slam a door. You could never leave a conversation and not come back. You could never decide that a person was finished for you and walk into a life that did not contain them. Every relationship is permanent, whether you want it or not. Every wound stays in the room. Every reconciliation is forced, because the alternative to reconciliation is a lifetime beside someone you cannot forgive and cannot escape. A world with no door is a world where nothing is ever truly over. And a door welded shut reshapes more than a society. It reshapes the single mind living behind it. A person who has never once been able to leave, who holds no concept of elsewhere, who has spent an entire life inside walls that were never even understood as walls, carries something in their head that no one on earth has ever carried. The human mind was built across millions of years for open country, for far horizons, for the knowledge that beyond the next ridge, there is always more world. What happens to that mind when it spends its whole life and hands down that same life across 16 generations, inside a world it can never leave, under a horizon that never, ever changes? The thing that breaks people in confinement is not the confinement. Humans have endured astonishing enclosure and come out whole. We are tougher than the cage, most of the time. What breaks people is confinement with no end, and that is the one kind the middle generations face. We have studied this carefully, in the closest places to a generation ship we can build. The crews who winter over in Antarctic darkness, the submariners sealed under the ocean for months, the volunteers in long isolation experiments meant to model the trip to Mars. The findings repeat. Depression creeps in. Sleep falls apart. People develop a vacant, fixed stare that the polar crews gave a name to. Small irritations swell into feuds, and morale tends to sink not at the hardest moment but at the psychological midpoint, the long stretch where the start is far behind and the end still feels impossibly distant. But the research also found what protects people: meaningful work, routine, a tight, trusting group. And above all, one thing, a known end. People endure almost anything when they are certain it will finish. That is exactly the protection the middle generations do not have. For the Antarctic crew, the submariner, even the prisoner counting a sentence, the confinement is bounded. There is a date, a release, a moment of stepping back out into the world. The whole of their endurance rests on the words, "I will get out." The middle generations never get out. They are born inside the walls, and they die inside the walls, and there is no date, no release, no stepping out, not for them and not for their children. The single most powerful thing that lets human beings survive enclosure is simply absent. What they face is not confinement, which we know how to bear. It is unbounded confinement, which no human in history has ever lived. So the question sharpens to its hardest point. How do you find purpose in a journey you will never complete? A task you will never finish. A destination you will never see, will never even glimpse, that you will only ever work toward and hand onward, unfinished, to someone who will do the same. Said plainly, it sounds unbearable. And yet human beings already know how to do this. We have always known. The masons who raised the great cathedrals of Europe worked on buildings that took 2, 3, sometimes 600 years to finish. They cut and set stone with a certain knowledge that they would be dust long before the last spire went up, that their grandchildren's grandchildren might see it completed, and they not. They did not find that meaningless. They found it among the most meaningful things a person could do, to give your hands to something so much larger than your own short life that you would never see it whole. Parents do a smaller version every day, pouring themselves into children whose full lives they will not live to see. The old proverb says, "A people grows great when its elders plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit." Meaning that does not require you to reach the end is not exotic or strange. It is one of the oldest and deepest kinds of meaning we have. The middle generations are the cathedral builders, and their cathedral is the crossing itself. On this ship, that kind of meaning is not a comfort laid on top of survival. It is survival. A population that loses its sense of purpose does not merely feel low. It stops tending the systems with full care. It stops cooperating when cooperation is hard. It stops having the children the whole mission depends on. Meaning here is load-bearing, as structural as the hull, as necessary as the air. The man who studied human endurance inside the worst place our species ever made came back with one finding above all others. A person who holds a why can bear almost any how. On the ship, the why is infrastructure, and keeping it alive is as vital as keeping the reactor lit. This quietly overturns something we assumed from the first night. We treated the destination as the point, and the middle generations as robbed of it. But for them, perhaps the destination was never the point, and never could have been. Their meaning does not come from arriving. It comes from holding the chain, from being a good link in it. And a good link is a whole thing, not a broken piece of some other whole thing. A life that bears the weight and passes it cleanly onward is complete in itself, not complete only if it reaches the far shore. The middle generations are means, exactly as we said, and they are also, at the very same time, ends in themselves, finding inside the meansness a meaning that stands entirely on its own. Both of those are true, and this is the first place the two have been allowed to rest together. A hard question shadows this, and I will not hide from it. Is the meaning they find truly their own, or is it installed the way their contentment was installed? If the mission must make sure its people find purpose, then purpose too becomes something the ship produces, and we are back inside the shaping. But follow that doubt all the way, and it dissolves, because all human meaning is partly given. The cathedral builder's pride was shaped by a faith and a culture taught to him before he could choose either, and we do not call his meaning false. The meaning the middle generations find is exactly as real and exactly as shaped as any meaning any human has ever found, as real as yours, which is to say genuinely real, and also, always, partly handed to us by the world that raised us. The line between authentic meaning and engineered meaning was never sharp for anyone. Here is the thing I did not expect to find at the bottom of all this darkness. I keep thinking of the countless people across history who were born, lived their whole lives, and died within sight of a single unchanging hill, in a village they never once left, under a horizon that never moved. They loved, they worked. They raised children and buried parents and found the days full. Almost none of them felt their lives were small. A whole human life can happen under an unchanging horizon because whole human lives have always happened that way, far more often than not. The middle generations live that ancient human condition, only sealed tighter and carried farther. Their horizon is a curved wall instead of a green hill, and a complete life can be lived inside it all the same, full of meaning that is theirs in every way that meaning is ever anyone's. So suppose they hold. Suppose the chain stays unbroken, the meaning holds, the people in the middle live full lives and pass the weight forward, all the way across the dark, generation after generation, to the very end. The question the entire sacrifice was built around finally comes due. What actually waits at the far shore? And is it anything like what the founders promised? And the cruelest part is that the single most dangerous moment of the whole voyage is not the long, dark middle they survived. It is the arrival itself. Why is the end of the journey the deadliest part of all? We picture the destination as the safe harbor at the end of the danger. Survive the long dark, the thinking goes, and arriving is the reward, the easy part, the moment you finally rest. The physics says the exact opposite. The single most dangerous act of the entire voyage is the arrival itself. The crew spent 400 years surviving the easy part. The trouble is that stopping is harder than going. The ship spent centuries building up its speed, and nothing in the space ahead will slow it down. No air to brake against, no ground, no friction of any kind. To come to rest at the destination, the ship has to fire its engines just as hard in reverse, for just as long, burning as much energy to halt as it spent to fly. Everything we said about the cost of leaving comes due a second time, at the far end, and now it must be paid simply to arrive instead of to sail straight past. The bill the founders paid to depart, the arrival generation pays again to stop. And the stopping cannot wait until you are there. The braking has to begin decades, perhaps a century, before the ship reaches the star, while the destination is still only a distant point of light, no brighter than the rest. Begin too late, and the ship overshoots. It sails straight through the target system at a fraction of the speed of light, unable to slow. The world it crossed everything to reach dwindling behind it forever, with no fuel left to turn and no lifetimes left to try. Of all the maneuvers in the voyage, this is the one with no second attempt. You get the timing right, across a century of burn, or you spend eternity flying away from the only place you were ever going. Now lay that against everything we know about the state of the ship by then. The hardest maneuver of the entire crossing sustained maximum thrust for decades, the structure loaded as it has not been loaded since the launch, the engines pouring out heat that a tired ship must somehow shed, is asked of the vessel at its most worn. Centuries old, fatigued in every beam, patched in 1,000 places, its deepest understanding possibly thinned by the long relay of hands that carried it, generation to generation, away from the founders who actually knew how it worked. The most demanding test of the whole voyage arrives precisely when the ship is least able to pass it, run by the people furthest in time from the ones who built it. Every weakness that crept in across 400 years, every worn part and every half-forgotten skill, converges on the one moment that matters more than any other. The ship is weakest at the exact instant it must be strongest. And it has to be precise. After centuries and tens of light years, the navigation must be exact enough to break into the right place, and tiny errors compound brutally across that much distance. The target star itself has drifted while the ship was in flight. The founders did not aim at where it was. They aimed at where it would be. Centuries later, a moving target tracked across an ocean of dark. Any error in those original observations, gathered by telescopes 400 years before arrival, could leave the ship, firing its engines to stop beside an empty patch of space, the world it sought sitting somewhere it never quite reached. There is a clean way to picture the whole maneuver. For centuries, the ship has, in effect, been falling toward its target, building up a speed it now has to undo before it arrives. Not a fall onto a ground that would smash it. The danger runs the other way. Shed all of that fall or sail past forever. A fall 400 years in the making that has to be turned by the engines the founders chose, and the last generation must light decades ahead of time into a soft and exact arrival with no ground to catch them and no chance to do it twice. Of every burden in this story, the last generations may be the heaviest because they carry the meaning of everyone who came before. To fail here is the worst of all the ways to fail, because failing here reaches backward and empties every life that was ever spent. The chain held for 16 generations. Every person in the middle poured their one life into keeping it unbroken, found their meaning in being a good link, passed the weight cleanly on, and it all comes down to whether the final hands can set it down safely at the doorstep or drop it there. The arrival generation inherits not only the danger of the burn, but the entire accumulated worth of the voyage, the redemption or the waste of 4 centuries of human sacrifice, riding on a single maneuver they might get wrong. They are the only generation who could make all of it count, and the only generation who could make none of it count, and they do not get to choose which until the engines have finished firing. But suppose they do it. Suppose the oldest ship, run by the last generation, executes the hardest maneuver of the whole crossing flawlessly. Suppose it sheds 400 years of speed across a perfect century-long burn and breaks gently into orbit exactly where the founders aimed. They have survived the dark, and now they have survived the arrival too. The doors have not opened on anything yet, but the ship is finally still, holding above the world that every life was spent to reach. And the arrival generation looks down at it, the destination chosen 400 years ago by people long dead, from telescopes peering at a faint star 100 trillion miles away, and asks the one question no amount of perfect flying can answer. Is it even a place a human being could live? After everything, after the crossing and the stopping and the sacrifice of 16 generations, what if the world they came all this way for cannot hold them at all? It might be a place no human could ever live, and the worst part is this. 400 years, 16 generations, every life and every sacrifice in the whole crossing were staked, completely and beyond recall, on a guess made from a smudge of old light. The founders did not choose a destination. No one had ever seen the destination. They chose an inference about a destination and bet everything on it being true. Consider how little we can actually learn about a world from light years away. We can detect that a planet is there. We can measure, roughly, how heavy it is, and how wide, how far it orbits, and how fast, with the best instruments, On a lucky few, we can catch a faint hint of an atmosphere. What we cannot see is the thing that matters: the surface, the weather, the chemistry of the air, whether it could be breathed, whether liquid water actually pools there, or whether the world is a furnace or a frozen stone. We get a smudge and a handful of numbers, and from that smudge we infer the single most loaded word in the search: habitable. And that word means far less than it sounds. The habitable zone is only the band of distance from a star where liquid water could exist, if everything else about the planet happened to cooperate. It promises nothing about whether anything else does. Earth sits in the Sun's habitable zone. So, more or less, do Venus and Mars. One of those three is a paradise, and the other two would kill you within minutes, one by crushing, boiling acid, the other by freezing you in air too thin to breathe. In the habitable zone is not the answer to the question of whether a world can hold you. It is barely the beginning of it. Take the nearest and best candidate we actually have. A planet was confirmed in 2016, orbiting the closest star to our Sun, sitting in the habitable zone, roughly the mass of the Earth. On paper, the dream. Now the fine print. It circles a small red star that flares with hundreds of times the violence of our own Sun, drowning the planet again and again in bursts of radiation that may already have torn its atmosphere clean off. Orbiting so close, it almost certainly keeps one face turned toward its star forever. An eternal scorched noon on one side, an eternal frozen midnight on the other, with only a thin ring of twilight between them where anything might survive. And after years of trying, we still cannot confirm it holds any air at all. The best, nearest world humanity has ever found is, looked at closely, a place that might kill you the moment you arrived. And that is the good option, the one we know the most about. The data that chose the destination was old before anyone used it. The light the founders studied left that star years before it ever reached their telescopes, so they were looking at the star as it had already been, in its own past. And stars change. A planet's atmosphere can be stripped by flares across the centuries of the voyage. The world the founders aimed at and the world the ship arrives at are separated by 400 years of everything no one was there to watch. The founders bet 16 generations of human lives on a portrait that was out of date before it was ever painted. Here is the cruelest twist in the structure, and it inverts everything we expect about reaching a goal. Normally, the closer you get to something, the better you can see it, and you adjust your plan as the truth comes into focus. The generation ship turns that backward. The braking burn has to begin decades before arrival, which is decades before the ship can finally see the destination clearly enough to know whether it is livable. So the ship commits its one irreversible act, the long burn to stop while the world is still a smudge. And then it arrives, able at last to see the truth in full detail, and already committed to stopping there, with no fuel left to go anywhere else. You learn whether the bet paid off only after the moment when you could still have changed the bet has passed. The ship gains perfect sight exactly when sight can no longer save it. And there is no second world to try. The ship carried enough for one destination, one braking burn, one arrival. The next candidate star is decades or centuries further on, and the fuel, the time, the margin, all of it is spent. A planet that cannot be lived on is not a detour to be corrected. You cannot push on, with nothing left to push with. You cannot turn back, for all the reasons that were sealed in at launch. Arriving at a world that cannot hold you is, in the end, almost impossible to tell apart from a death sentence that simply took 400 years to be carried out. The choices left at a hostile world are all versions of the same ending. Stay in the failing ship that was never meant to be a forever home, only a vehicle, and watch it wear down around you. Try to wrestle a lethal world into something survivable across centuries more, with a dying vessel and no help. Or burn what little remains chasing another star you will never reach. Each is the same conclusion, arriving at a different speed. The founders did not gamble their own lives on the guess. They gambled 16 generations of lives that did not yet exist, on a photograph of a place they would never see, taken from 100 trillion miles away, already stale when they held it. A promise made by people who would be long dead to people not yet born, about a world none of them could ever check, enforced by a physics that allowed no one in between to refuse it. And the descendants may cross all of it, be remade by the voyage into something tuned to the ship and the dark, only to arrive at a world that cannot use them, having become, somewhere along the way, people who could never have gone home either, changed for a destination that lied. If all of that is true, if the human cost is this staggering and this uncertain, 16 generations of lives staked on old light and possibly spent for nothing, then a hard question rises that we have been avoiding the whole way. Why send the people through the middle at all? Why not freeze them and skip the lifetimes? Why not send only embryos or only machines and spare the generations the entire ordeal? Could this be done without the people who pay for it? And if it could, what exactly would be lost by leaving them out? You could do it without the middle generations. There are 3 ways, and they share one thing that should stop you cold. Every single one of them solves the suffering of the middle generations by removing the middle generations. Start with sleep. Freeze the crew at departure, the thinking goes, and they do not age, do not eat, do not suffer, do not need to be replaced. They close their eyes, leaving Earth, and open them at the new world. And from inside, the crossing is instant. No generations at all. The founders are the arrivals. The trouble is that we cannot do it, and may never be able to. Freezing a complex living body tears it apart from the inside, as ice crystals form in every cell and rupture it. We can turn small samples to glass without that damage, a few cells, an embryo, but no one has come close to doing it to a whole human brain and bringing it back. And even if we could, sleep takes away the one thing that made the ship survivable. With everyone frozen, no conscious mind is awake for centuries to meet the emergency no one planned for, to repair the failure no machine anticipated. The generation ship's deepest redundancy was always the adaptive human aboard, and cryosleep removes exactly that. You trade the lives of the generations for an empty wheelhouse, crossing the dark on faith. The second way empties the ship of people entirely. Carry only frozen embryos, tiny, light, holding more genetic variety than any living crew could, and near the end of the voyage, grow them in artificial wombs and raise the first humans by machine. The ship crosses for centuries with no one alive inside it, then populates itself at the destination. Freezing embryos we already do. Growing a child entirely outside a body, we are only beginning to approach, having kept premature lambs alive in artificial sacs for a few weeks. But the deepest problem is not the womb. It is everything after. Who teaches these children to be human? Language, love, culture, the meaning of a life. All of it passes from human to human, and the most important part of it, we have already seen, cannot be stored or downloaded. You would raise biologically human children with no parents, no culture, no thread back to the entire human past, raised by machines that can hold the information and not the understanding. They would be the most unprecedented and most profoundly orphaned people who ever lived. The third way sends no people at all. Machines do not need air or water or sleep, do not suffer, do not require generations. Send robots to explore, to build, to prepare a world, or simply to go in our place and send the knowledge home. It is the safest and cheapest path by far, and it solves the engineering by quietly abandoning the goal. If the point was to spread humanity to the stars, robots spread machines. If the point was to learn about other worlds, robots do it better than any fragile human ever could, and the humans may as well stay home. The robot mission succeeds at everything, except the one thing the generation ship was ever for. Now stand back and look at all three together. Sleep removes the middle generations by erasing the time, so that no one is awake to live it. The embryo ship removes them by emptying the vessel of people, so that no one is aboard to live it. The robots remove them by sending no people, so that no one exists to live it. Each is praised as the humane answer, and each is humane in exactly one way, by making certain that no one is there to suffer. The alternatives do not ease the suffering of the people in the middle. They abolish the people in the middle. They solve the moral problem by deleting the ones who had it. And that reveals what this whole story has been circling. The middle generations were never an unfortunate side effect of the generation ship, a flaw to be engineered away. They were the generation ship. A generation ship simply is the version of crossing the dark in which people live and die on the way. Every alternative is a way of not building one, of getting the cargo to the far shore without the lives. So the question, can we do this without the middle generations, is really a different question wearing a disguise. Do we need the journey to be lived, or do we only need the cargo to arrive? And that depends entirely on what the journey is for. If the goal is delivery, getting genes or a colony or a human foothold to another star, then the alternatives win every time, and the generation ship is the worst option there is, the one that piles up the most human cost for the same arrival. If all you want is the cargo there, you should erase the middle. But if the goal includes the living, if what we value is not merely that humanity arrives but that humans cross, that there is an unbroken thread of waking human experience running all the way from Earth to the new world, that the journey is part of being human and not just an obstacle between us and the prize, then the middle generations are not a cost at all. They are the entire point. See what each deletion takes away along with the suffering. The sleeper sleeps through the most extraordinary voyage in the history of our species, 400 years in the deep dark, witnessed by no one. The embryo ship crosses as a sealed tomb of frozen possibility. No eyes open in the dark, no continuous human story. The first children orphaned from everything human at the end. The robots arrive with no human anywhere aboard. In every case, the price of removing the suffering is removing the living. And with the living goes the meaning the middle generations found, the witnessing, the unbroken thread, the simple fact of being there. You can deliver humanity to the stars without a single human living the journey. But then, no human has crossed. Only cargo has arrived. The same sentence haunts all three solutions. No one suffers because no one is there. And that should sit uneasily, because it is the same shape as the kindness that disturbed us before, the contentment grown into a child to spare it longing. That answer removed the desire that would suffer. These answers remove the person who would suffer. Both are humane. Both are a kind of deletion, and both run on a logic that does not quite hold still under the eye. That the surest way to spare a person every pain is to make certain they never exist. True, the unborn never weep, and yet. So by trying to erase the middle generations, the alternatives prove that the generation ship only makes sense if the middle generations are the point, if the journey is for the living, and not only for the arrival. Follow that one step further, into stranger ground. If the people in the middle are the point, and not the destination, if their lives across the dark are themselves the thing of value, then maybe the destination was never the necessary part at all. Maybe a people who live whole, meaningful lives crossing the void do not actually need to arrive anywhere. What if the ship was the home all along, and reaching a planet is the one part of this you could simply do without? Then no one disembarks. And that would not be a malfunction. It might be the truest thing the entire voyage ever produces. Because to the people who actually arrive, the ship is home, and the planet is the alien, terrifying thing. The destination the founders dreamed of is, to their descendants, the last place in the universe they would ever want to go. Think about who steps up to that window at the end. Not a single one of them has ever known anything but the ship. Home, to them, means curved floors and recycled air, the hum of the spin underfoot, the faces they have known since birth, walls that have always been there. A planet is everything home is not. An open sky with nothing above it, which to a child raised inside a sphere reads not as freedom, but as a bottomless fall. No walls, no ceiling, weather that no one controls. A wild, uncontrolled ecology that answers to nobody. A sun that burns the skin. Pathogens against which they carry no defense at all. Everything that makes a planet home to you and me is precisely what would make it a nightmare to them. Their bodies may agree. Generations shaped by spin gravity instead of real weight, by recycled air, by the ship's own narrow community of microbes, may simply not fit a true world. The pull of real gravity could be wrong in the inner ear. The sun's full radiation could be dangerous. The planet's microbes could be lethal to immune systems that have never met them. Stepping onto the surface might not be a homecoming. It might be the most dangerous thing any of them ever did, and for some, the last. So the arrival the founders pictured as triumph becomes, for the people who reach it, something closer to catastrophe. They are being asked to abandon the only home they have ever known, to climb down into a terrifying open void, to dismantle their entire civilization for the sake of a dream that belonged to people 16 generations dead. The mission's success, colonizing the planet, is from inside the arrival generation an eviction from their world. The dream come true arrives as an existential threat. The founders and the arrivals want opposite things, and neither of them is wrong. To the founders, who knew the open sky of Earth, the planet was home, and the ship was only a corridor, a hard passage to be endured on the way to solid ground. To the arrivals, who knew only the ship is home, and the planet is the abyss. The voyage contains, folded into its enormous length, a complete reversal of what the words home and destination even mean. The founders aimed their descendants at a planet. Their descendants became people for whom that planet is the one place they would never choose to be. History is full of this, in miniature. Places built only to be passed through that quietly became places to stay. The trading post, the way station, the fort on the frontier, each meant as a stop on the road to somewhere else, each growing, over generations, into a city in its own right. The infrastructure of the journey became the destination. The ship was built as a corridor between two worlds. Across 16 generations, the corridor became a world. The road became a town, and the people walking it stopped being travelers and became citizens of the road itself. There are two honest ways to see this, and they could not be further apart. One says it is the deepest failure of all. The founder's dream dies. No colony is planted. The entire stated purpose of the mission is refused by the only people who could ever have fulfilled it, and 400 years of sacrifice end with a ship full of people who will not get out. The other says it is the deepest success imaginable. Humanity never needed the planet at all. The middle generations built something whole, self-sufficient, free, and full of meaning, in the empty dark, with no ground beneath them. The ship became a permanent human world. The journey was never the cost of the achievement. The journey was the achievement. Perhaps the real thing the generation ship proved was never that humans could reach another star. It was that humans could live, complete and self-sustaining and at home, in a world they built and carried with them, needing no planet anywhere. I think of every place human beings were only ever supposed to pass through and stayed. The crowded steerage of an immigrant ship, the camp that was meant to last a season, the shelter raised for an emergency that somehow held a whole childhood inside it. Against every intention, these became the places where lives actually happened, where children were born and loved, where a people and a way of being took shape. The ship is the largest version of this there has ever been. Designed to get somewhere, it became the somewhere. And the people inside do not experience their lives as a transit, or a sacrifice, or a means to anyone's end. They experience them as home, full, ordinary, complete, the only home there is, and a good one. The ship is still aging. It is still, from the first day, slowly dying, and the planet they refuse may be the one piece of solid ground that could ever have outlasted it. A people who choose their home over the world below them may be choosing their world over their survival, because a built thing cannot hold against entropy forever, and a planet, for all its terrors, can. The most human thing they could possibly do, to make a true home of the corridor, to belong fully where they are, might also be the thing that, in the end, leaves them with nowhere left to go. The beauty of a home adrift and the danger of a home adrift are not two facts. They are one fact, seen from the inside and from the outside. And here, at last, the question from the first night has its answer. Would you recognize your descendants? Perhaps not, and not because they became monsters or grew strange new bodies in the dark, because they became something genuinely new under the sky. The first human beings for whom home is a built world adrift in the void, for whom a planet is the alien thing, who never needed Earth or any Earth at all. Human, fully and recognizably human, and transformed all the same into a kind of human that has never existed before. Now step all the way back from the whole enterprise. If this is what it takes, 16 generations and all that cost and all that transformation, and even then the likeliest outcome is not a galaxy full of human worlds, but a single fragile habitat drifting quietly in the dark or failing silently in it, then crossing the void is harder than almost anything a species could attempt. And that difficulty might explain the strangest fact about the sky over our heads. We have looked and found no one. If the crossing is this hard for anyone who tries it, could the silence itself be the evidence, the quiet proof of how rarely, if ever, anyone makes it across at all? It might. And to feel why, you only have to take what we have learned tonight and lift it up to the scale of the whole galaxy. Our galaxy is something like 13 billion years old and 100,000 light-years across, with hundreds of billions of stars and, we now know, planets almost everywhere we look. Even at the crawling pace we have spent all night describing, 1% of the speed of light, a single patient civilization could cross the entire galaxy in about 10 million years. Against 13 billion years of time, that is nothing. Anyone who started early enough could have crossed the whole thing more than 1,000 times over by now. And yet, as far as we can tell, no one ever has. The sky is silent. The silence is louder than people first realize. It is not merely that we have not picked up a radio broadcast from some distant world. It is that in all the billions of years there was time for it, no one has ever come here. If crossing the dark were anything close to easy, the galaxy should be full. Every habitable world visited or settled long before our species ever stood upright. Instead, every star we examine is quiet, every sky empty of any sign that anyone else is out there at all. The emptiness itself is the thing that demands an explanation. A physicist named Enrico Fermi put it as a simple question over lunch one day. Where is everybody? There is a frightening answer that people reach for first. Perhaps something makes the long climb, from dead matter to a civilization that spreads among the stars, nearly impossible. A filter somewhere along the way that almost nothing passes. And the darkest version places that filter ahead of us, not behind, suggesting that civilizations reliably destroy themselves before they ever spread, that the silence is the silence of the dead. But we have spent this whole night learning a gentler possibility and a stranger one. We now know, in detail, in our bones, exactly how hard the crossing is, the distance that outlives the traveler, the speed that turns empty space into a weapon, the energy that dwarfs a civilization, the centuries, the transformation of the people who go, the staggering moral weight of it, and the likelihood that even a success is a single fragile world adrift that may fail in the dark or arrive and refuse to leave the ship. Take that wall, the one we have stood in front of all night, and set it in front of every species that ever woke up on every world. Maybe almost no one ever crosses, not because they die, because the dark is simply too wide. If that is true, then the silence means something far softer than corpses. Maybe the galaxy is not empty at all. Maybe it is full. Full of life, full of civilizations, each one sitting on its own world, each one having looked up at the same impossible distance we have looked at tonight, and each one having quietly decided, or simply been unable, to cross it. The silence would not be the silence of extinction. It would be the silence of distance, the same severing distance that, on a single ship, cut the departure away from the arrival, scaled up until it cuts every world away from every other world, completely, forever. There is an unexpected tenderness in that reading. It is not cosmic loneliness. It is something closer to cosmic shyness. A galaxy full of people, each one home on its own small world, each one looking up into the same quiet dark, each one asking the very question Fermi asked, and every single one of them being part of the everybody the question is looking for. We may not be alone in the way we fear. We may be surrounded, on every side, by others exactly as stuck as we are. All of us home, none of us able to visit, all of us wondering where everyone else has gone. Maybe life really is rare. Maybe intelligence is a fluke that almost never happens. Maybe we are simply early, among the first to arrive in a galaxy that will fill up long after we are gone. Maybe they are out there and silent, or watching, or using ways of speaking we cannot yet hear. We do not know. Anyone who tells you they know is telling you a story. But after tonight, we can hold this one possibility with a weight we could not have held before. We have not solved the silence. We have only learned, intimately, why it might be there. The silence used to sound to me like emptiness. After tonight, it sounds like something else. A quiet sky is not the absence of an answer. It is an answer, or the beginning of one. It is information. It tells us that whatever is out there, it has not come here. In all the long ages, there was time to come, and one thing that could make that true is exactly the wall we have spent the night standing in front of. The dark over our heads is not blank. It is full of a meaning we are only beginning to read, and it may be full of company we will never reach. And this is where the whole night quietly turns around. We have spent it imagining people sealed inside a small world, crossing a dark they may never finish crossing, perhaps surrounded the whole way by others doing exactly the same. And the quiet sky suggests that this might not be a story about distant ships in the imagination at all. It might be a story about every world and every people, sealed each in its own way, under its own patch of silent dark. Including this one, including the sky above you, right now, wherever you happen to be lying as you listen to this. The generation ship was never only a vessel out there among the stars. So let me ask it the only way that has ever really mattered. What does all of this mean for you, here, tonight, under this same quiet sky? What it means for you is that the story was never really about them. It was about you. Not because the Earth is a kind of ship, though you could say that. Something closer and more personal than that. You are a middle generation. You have been one your whole life. You were born into a world you did not choose. You did not design your body, or pick your language, or agree to the century you arrived in, or sign anything at all. The world was already old and already in motion when you got here, full of rules made by people long dead, and you were simply set down inside it and asked to carry on. The contract no one signed, the one that troubled us so much when it belonged to people on a ship, is the ordinary contract of every birth that has ever happened, including yours. And your body, right now, is the living end of a chain that has never once broken. This is not a figure of speech. The genes inside you were passed from parent to child, in an unbroken line, for almost 4 billion years. Every single one of your ancestors, all the way back, without one exception, survived long enough to pass life onward. Not most of them, all of them. A chain of nearly 4 billion years, and not a single link ever failed, or you would not be here to hear this. You are the current carrier of a relay far longer than any voyage between stars, one that began before there were eyes to see the dark, and you are holding it tonight, in your chest, as you breathe. You will never see where it started, and you will never see where it ends. You did not witness the first living thing, or the long line of creatures that became you. You will not see what your descendants become, whether they stay on this one world or someday cross the dark themselves, what they will look like, whether they would recognize you. You are in the deep middle of something vast, holding the weight, passing it forward, with no sight of either shore. The ship did not invent that condition. It only built it large enough, and slow enough, and strange enough, that we could finally see the shape of the thing we have always been inside. We spent the night feeling the horror of being used as a means, a life spent for an end it would never reach. And then we found the other half of the truth. A link is a whole thing, not a fragment of something whole, but complete in itself. Being a middle generation is not the lesser way to live a life. It is the most common and the most complete form a human life has ever taken. Nearly everyone who has ever lived exactly this way, holding the world for a while and handing it on, never seeing the start or the finish. You were given a body and a world you did not choose, by people who kept the chain alive long enough to reach you, and one day you will pass them forward in your turn. That is not a smaller life. It is the only kind of life there has ever been. And you were cared for more deeply than you know. Every one of those countless ancestors, across almost 4 billion years, was kept alive, fed, warmed, defended, loved, or at the very least carried, long enough to pass life on. You are not simply holding a chain. You are the accumulated success of every creature that ever managed to keep going, the living edge of an unbroken effort that has never, in 4 billion years, given up. You were handed a body, yes. You were also handed everything every ancestor ever managed to carry through the dark behind them. In the most literal sense there is, you are deeply tended, held by everyone who came before, holding, now, for everyone who comes after. So let it come all the way down to where you actually are. Lying in the dark, wherever you are. The air moving quietly in and out of you, made breathable by a living world the way the ship's air was kept by its garden. The water in you, that has been so many other living things, resting for a little while in the shape of you. And in every cell, the long relay, nearly 4 billion years of it, sitting inside you in the dark, doing what it has always done, simply continuing. The walls of your room are an unchanging horizon, and a whole and meaningful life is happening inside them tonight, the way whole lives have always happened under unchanging horizons. You are, right now, this very night, a middle generation, holding the weight, in the dark, and that is enough. That is whole. That is the oldest and most complete thing a person can be. This is the stillness I hoped we might reach. Not the feeling that your life is small, or borrowed, or only a means to someone else's arrival. The opposite. The quiet certainty that you are a cared-for link in something unbroken and far older than any ship, and that holding your part of it, in the dark, without ever seeing the shores, is not a sentence laid on you. It is a belonging. You were never required to reach the end. You never could, and you never had to. You only have to hold your part of the chain the way everyone before you did, and that holding, all on its own, is a full and finished and meaningful life. The most frightening thing about the generation ship was that it seemed to make us into a means. And the truth underneath the fear, on the ship and here in your own bed, is that we were never only means. We were always links, tended and tending. And that is the whole of what it has ever meant to be alive. Thank you for spending this part of your one life here, in the dark, with me. For giving these hours to people who do not exist, and a sky that will not answer, and a ship that may never be built. It means more than I can easily say that you were here. The chain has carried itself across almost 4 billion years in part by resting. Every link, every night, laying the weight down for a while and trusting the morning to pick it up again. So you can let it rest in you tonight. You do not have to hold it tightly while you sleep. It will hold itself the way it always has, the way it held every ancestor who ever closed their eyes in the dark and trusted the chain to still be there at dawn. Close your eyes. You are a link that gets to rest tonight, held by everyone behind you, holding gently for everyone ahead. Good night.